Sorry about the error there. I was trying to do multiple things at once, but welcome back. It's been a while, but today is going to be a pretty good show. Um, really just talking about schedules, talking about top matchups for the year. I also wanted to discuss some news that has been relevant over the past 24 hours regarding Texas Tech and Michigan State, and we are going to work that in with my plan for today's episode as is. So, lot of ground to cover, a lot of stuff to talk about. I'm excited. Hopefully you're excited here. Before we begin, all I ask is that you would do a few things to support the channel. Like the stream and keep this on in the background for as long as you can. Watch time and likes impact me in a positive way more than subscribers do, actually. But if you want to subscribe and hit the notification bell, that's helpful as well. And also, check out my Patreon page via the link in the description. Monthly donations do help me keep this channel up to work, keep it updated, keep it flowing, and they keep the content flowing to you. And check out the merchandise store, which is also in the link via the description. I haven't worn a lot of my own merchandise for a while because it's the summer, spring, and a lot of the stuff I have that is my merchandise is sweatshirts. And I also have gained quite a bit of weight over the past year or two. So a lot of the shirts that I own from my own merchandise store are now a size too small, but they're really comfortable. They keep you cool in the summer. They can keep you warm in the winter. High quality stuff too. It takes a while for them to show any type of wear and tear. So check out that merchandise store, do those things, and let's get started here. I think talking about the top 10 matchups is the best place to get started. It's the most exciting thing, the most controversial thing, the best thing. We'll then get into schedules and then talk about some things relating to team specifics. So how do I determine what my top 10 matchups are? Well, I determine my top 10 matchups by looking at my power ratings and deciding what matchups have the highest combination of my power ratings, and then factoring in the projected margin of victory. So the top 10 matchups are determined by which games I think will feature the highest rated teams and which teams are going to have which games are going to have the closest margin of victory, projected margin of victory within those top end games. And I will say most of these games are in the Big Ten. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I think the top of the Big Ten is stronger than the top of the SEC this year, and the top SEC teams don't really play each other. So Georgia doesn't play Texas or LSU. They get Oklahoma at home. So while that is a big-time game, Georgia's margin of victory projected is large enough where it's not going to be as entertaining. Texas plays LSU on the road. That's a big game. Again, unfortunately, though, they don't play Georgia on the road or at home, and that would have been probably a top 5 game using my system. So getting into the top 10 games, projected, of course, because this is the preseason for 2026. What are the 10 best games in the 2026 college football season? Well, it is only June, but I want to project the top 10 games for 2026, the top 10 matchups, using my power ratings. And how we're going to do this is I'm going to use my power ratings to determine the highest combination of power ratings in all college football matchups. So, of course, this will be in the Power 4, mostly the Big Ten, mostly the SEC. And then I'm going to use projected margin of victory or point spread from my model as a way to kind of decide a tie-breaking vote between top-end matchups. The best matchup, in my opinion, for the 2026 season has got to be Oregon at Ohio State. Oregon is first in my power ratings and by nearly a field goal over team number 2. Ohio State's 4th in my power ratings. And since Ohio State plays host here, and they play host 3 time zones over, what you are looking at here is a game where it's essentially a pick'em, in my opinion. So 3 points home field, that's just the standard across all models in college football. I add an additional point on to home field advantage when the host is hosting a team who is a time zone over. So 1 point per change in time zone, 1 point per differential an hour. So since Oregon is 3 hours behind Ohio State, then Ohio State, in at least my opinion, gets an additional, 3 points. So Ohio State's home field advantage in this game is closer to a touchdown than a field goal when you factor in the travel, when you factor in the difference in time zones, when you factor in the bodily clocks of the players for Oregon are going to have to adjust to this trip. And I have Oregon about favored over Ohio State by close to a touchdown because I'm that high on Oregon this year. So this game reminds me a lot of when Ohio State went to Oregon in 2024, where I think Ohio State was possibly even on an average basis double-digit points better than Oregon that year, as you saw in the Rose Bowl when they played at a true neutral field. Oregon, though, was able to get them in the regular season by hosting them and essentially throwing the kitchen sink at them. And Ohio State staff is good enough to do that. Their roster is elite enough to do that. I have this game essentially as a pick'em, where either team could be favored by 1 or by a half a point, or it could just be a straight-up pick'em where no one is favored. Obviously, last season, Ohio State was, I would say, better, according to most models. Only FEI had Oregon ahead of Ohio State last year. Ohio State was ahead in FPI, efficiency, EPA per play. Oregon returns more production this year, only 6 percentage points more production, though. And in early S&P Plus, which factors in recruiting, returning production, past results, Ohio State would be favored by about 3.5 points neutral field. Factoring in home field advantage, they'd be favored by about 6.5, maybe 7 points in this game. This game will take place on November 7th, so by this game we will have a great idea of who both of these teams are. I expect this to be a competitive game and a one-score victory for either side, no more, no less. You have 2 top 5 rosters, 2 top 5 coaches, 2 top 5 programs in college football right now. So I believe this is the best matchup, or certainly one of the best, for the 2026 season. Just really quick before we close out here. These teams, outside of Indiana last year, were the other 2 of the top 3. So the top 3 Big Ten teams last year across most models were the top 3 teams, period, in college football. So there is a chance for this game to be the game of the century, where you have a number 1 Oregon, number 2 Ohio State, whether they're both undefeated or whether so many teams take a loss by November that one of them could have a loss and still be ranked top 2. It's going to be an incredible matchup. Up next, Ohio State at Indiana. That's my second best matchup for 2026. Indiana, we already have a way too early line for this game as it takes place on October 17th. They are favored per FanDuel by 1.5 points right now. So what that's saying is Ohio State is 1.5 points better neutral field, but you take in the fact that Indiana is playing host here. The host gets an additional 3 points, so now Indiana is a 1.5 point favorite as they are at home. With the Hoosiers, they were the only team last year who was consensusly better than Ohio State. There were some metrics like EPA per play margin that had Ohio State as the better team, and some models that, due to Ohio State's vastly superior NFL talent and college talent, had Ohio State ranked ahead of Indiana, or rated ahead of Indiana. And that makes sense when you look at how close they played each other in the Big Ten championship game. Ohio State could have easily won a rematch. We just never got to see that due to Ohio State losing to Miami and Indiana going on their incredible run. Indiana was ranked first or rated, I get those confused sometimes, first in FPI, first in efficiency, first in FEI, sixth in EPA per play margin, and they were also first in game control. This was the best big game team last year, winning all of their big games, several of them against Alabama and Oregon twice by double digits. They went 16-0 and completed, honestly, the most impressive college football season in the history of the sport. They only returned 56% of their production, though. Ohio State returns 60%, so only 4 percentage points more. But Ohio State, in terms of history, in terms of high school recruiting, is more proven to reload than Indiana. At the same time, it has been accepted by many that Indiana right now has the better staff. And by many, I mean some casuals, maybe even a plurality of casuals, but I would also say a majority of people I respect, even people who might be lower on Indiana specifically this year, view this staff as basically number 1 or number 2 in college football, and not any lower than that. And I completely agree with this. You can't go 27-2 over 2 years at Indiana with the talent they have, and you can't be a serious person and call it any bit flukish. You can't do it. You could call it maybe a little bit unsustainable to win 90% of your games every year on average, and you'd be correct in that. There is probably going to be at some point a season where Indiana is a really damn good team, but loses 2 games or loses 3 games in this modern era of college football. But this staff is incredible, and so is the staff that will be on the opposite sidelines in Ohio State. Ohio State will have Jeremiah Smith, a first-round pick. They'll have at least another first-round pick for 2027 on the defense. Julian Sayin is vying to be quarterback number 1. Bo Jackson's vying to be running back number 1. Indiana has to replace their round 1 pick 1 Heisman quarterback. Both teams return a lot on the offensive line. Indiana returns a lot on defense overall. Ohio State returns basically their entire offense outside of 3 starters last year. Their worst offensive lineman, tight end Max Clare, and wide receiver Carnell Tate, who was a top 5 pick in the 2026 NFL draft. This is another game where, look, Indiana's number 2 in my power ratings. Ohio State's number 4. Indiana plays host here, so I have Indiana favored actually by a little bit more than 1.5, but this should be a 1-score win for either side. I could see Indiana winning this by more than 1 score. I could also see, just due to the nature of college football recruiting and how important it is, if things pan out for Ohio State and don't pan out for Indiana, I could also see Ohio State winning by more than a touchdown. But this classifies to me as a game between 2 top 4 teams, 2 national title contenders, 2 staffs that are inside of the top 3, 2 defensive coordinators in Bryant Haynes and Matt Patricia, who are in the S tier for me and have elite defensive assistants as well, and 2 of the best receiver cores and offensive minds in all of college football. So I'm excited to see this game on October 17th in Bloomington. Game number 3, matchup number 3 here would be Ohio State at Texas. You're going to see Ohio State a lot. You're going to see the top teams a lot in this top 10 list. I think the only top 10 teams that are not featured here are Georgia and Texas Tech, and that has to do with the fact they have some of the easier schedules of the top 10 teams, and Georgia in the regular season does not play a team who is rated top 10 in my model. The toughest team they play in my model is Oklahoma at home, who's 11th. Texas Tech, the toughest team they play in the regular season is, I think, it's Oklahoma State, who's not even top 15 in my model. They have a cakewalk schedule, maybe the easiest in the Power 4. Texas and Ohio State have some of the toughest schedules in the sport, though. And this game will kick off in week 2. Texas, much like Indiana, is favored by 1.5 at home. The books, from what I can tell with these spreads, probably view Ohio State as number 1 in their ratings entering this season, which makes sense. Most preseason models have to factor in only the past and don't really project towards the future unless they have some type of human input. If your model is entirely without human input, you would have Ohio State number 1 like unanimously power rated across the board if your model does not have human input this year. They return enough production. They have been the best program over the past 2 seasons. And if you expand it out past that, they've been the best program of the past 3, past 4, and they have elite players. Texas made a lot of moves in the portal this season. They are in an all-in, win-it-all, make a postseason run or bust type season, and they played Ohio State competitively last year. I know Ohio State got out to a 14-point lead, and I know that people were saying that Texas scoring that late was functionally garbage time. But when you're only down by 7 and you're attempting a drive late in the game, and you're down by 7 because you're 1 of 5 on 4th down conversions, you're in the game. You weren't the better team. Ohio State was leading. Ohio State was in control, but it wasn't garbage time. And from there on out, well, Texas performed pretty terribly in September and October, rebounded a bit in November, and Ohio State was clearly a team that reloaded from the previous season, unlike Texas, who clearly had some issues. Texas is 6th in returning production. Ohio State's 31st. Texas, for now, is 3rd in my power ratings. Ohio State is 4th. So I would also have Texas favored by a little bit more at home than they are right now. Last season, Ohio State was 2nd in efficiency, FPI, and 3rd in FEI. Texas was outside the top 10 in all of those categories. This is the first game where I'm just going to come out and say that I favor one of these teams over the other for now. That being Ohio State over Texas. Because I think the gap in Ohio State's coaching and coordinators ahead of Texas is steeper than their advantage or disadvantage against Oregon or Indiana. I do think that way. However, I will also say here that this game is one of the best in America because Texas has a elite roster with, outside of Oregon, the most projected first rounders for the 2027 NFL Draft. You got Colin Simmons, you got Cam Coleman, possibly Ryan Wingo. You definitely have Trevor Gooseby, and you definitely have Arch Manning. I mean, there's a possible 5 first-rounders on this team right here, and it's more of a possibility that they have that than probably anyone else in the country except for, well, Oregon, I would say. This is an intriguing game, as I believe Texas has the superior roster and has some matchup advantages here that are quite stark. I also believe that Ohio State has the superior staff here and has some matchups coaching or roster-wise that are either noticeable or in the coaching department could certainly be stark. It's going to be a 7:30 p.m. kickoff, night game for Texas, and I believe this game is a must-win. Indiana versus Ohio State, Oregon versus Ohio State, the loser of that game can feel comfortable, depending on where they are at in the season. Ohio State and Texas have tough enough regular season schedules where a loss here means it's likely that they lose 3 games. The loser of this game is more likely to lose 3 games than 2 or 1, and obviously they wouldn't be going undefeated. And with the current format in the college football playoff, we've seen it before last year and in 2024, a quality 3-loss team from a tough conference who's power rated high will get left out for a team that is maybe rated a bit lower, isn't as good on paper, but has won an additional game or 2. So this could be a college football playoff elimination game when we look back on it. Matchup number 4, Ohio State at USC. I know so much Ohio State stuff here, and a lot of it is going to be Big Ten, but just bear with me. It has a lot to do with how my ratings work, and also it has to do with the fact that the top SEC teams just don't play each other as much as the top Big Ten teams do. You'd have a lot of SEC games, in fact, a majority of SEC games, if I were to do a number 11 through number 25 matchups. You'd have a majority SEC games there. We're just looking at the top 10. And Ohio State against USC on October 31st is certainly a top 10 matchup. USC is 10th in my ratings. Ohio State, as you already know through this video, is 4th. USC is 13th in returning production. this season, and they were a top 15 team last season. And like I mentioned earlier, where Oregon was traveling to Ohio State, and I gave Ohio State a 6-point home field advantage instead of a 3-point home field advantage, because Oregon has to travel 3 time zones over. They have to catch up on 3 hours. It's the same thing with USC here, with Ohio State. I have Ohio State favored by about a touchdown, 6 points over USC, neutral field. So that means that this is basically a pick'em where if I had to choose one team, it would be Ohio State by maybe a half point or 1 point, but it's essentially a pick'em here. What's fascinating about this matchup is not that there's a chance that due to coaching or due to roster that one of these teams has a clear advantage over the other. Indiana last year was the more efficient team than Ohio State with the better staff. So they were trading punches, and it was a battle of, okay, does Ohio State's NFL talent or does Indiana's better team cohesion, discipline, and coaching win? And that will be a similar question this year, albeit the talent between those two teams will be closer. For Oregon, Ohio State, it's a similar question. Who's the more talented roster? Who's the better staff? And there's an argument for both there. In every way, in every single way, Ohio State's going to be better than USC. It's different in regard from the previous matchups we've talked about, where Texas, Indiana, Oregon, Ohio State, we can all debate about those 4 teams. Ohio State and USC is a bit different here. But because of the travel, because of the home field advantage, and because of USC being one of the most veteran teams in college football, they have a chance in the Coliseum to pull off a stunning upset. And a game where I can only imagine that for better or for worse, the public sentiment will be that USC does not really have a chance to win this game due to being very disappointing under Riley, and Ohio State under Ryan Day has been an elite college football program. USC's hope here, their hope, is that their defensive line can take a big enough step forward to give Ohio State's offensive line issues. In an offense under Arthur Smith that is going to have a lot of variables to it. It could be a hire that turns Ohio State into the number 1 offense. It could be a hire that makes Ohio State's offense inefficient in terms of using their top-end players. That's Arthur Smith's history. You get either an offense that abuses their cheat codes or they ignore their cheat codes and not much in between. It's very oversimplistic. If USC can have a lines of scrimmage edge here, and they can utilize RPO against a much more inexperienced and a little bit of a, less athletic in terms of Arvell Reese and Sonny Styles were 6'4", 250, extremely fast, hyper-athletic linebackers, and Riley Pettyjohn and Peyton Pierce just aren't quite that, even from a potential angle. If USC can get RPO going, and they can capitalize on D-line, combine that with Ohio State's travel, and if all 3 of those things click, well, then USC will actually win and be favored here. The problem is USC needs a lot to get those things. They need Ohio State to not improve in some areas. They need themselves to really take a leap forward in certain areas. And that's what makes this a very intriguing matchup. It's a top 10 game where one team on paper in the preseason clearly has an edge. And right now, I would have Ohio State winning this game. But also, there is a world where, come kickoff, USC has some clear advantages here, and they're a bit undervalued, and that will be an opportunity for people to buy stock before this game closes out and the clock hits 0. The next matchup here, no longer talking about Ohio State. I imagine for some of you that is a bit of a relief, but we are going to be talking about Indiana and Michigan, taking place on October 24th. This game is much like Ohio State versus USC, in my opinion. IU versus Michigan would be anywhere between a touchdown to 10-point favorite for IU, in my opinion, neutral field, and there isn't the same travel edge here. But Michigan is at home. Michigan will be at home after playing Penn State at home, and Ohio State is going to be coming off an emotional game, whether a win or a loss over Ohio State, or to Ohio State. If you're Michigan here, you ideally probably want Indiana to beat Ohio State, so that if you do beat Indiana, well, you'll have a shot to earn a better win. And knowing Indiana and who they are, and the fact they have not lost back-to-back games yet under Curt Cignetti, for a variety of reasons, of course, but knowing their staff and knowing some of the players they have, they would be pretty furious if they were to drop a game. So, right here, what we have is a game where metrics will tell you that this is the most uneven game we've discussed so far. IU was vastly superior to Michigan last year in FPI, efficiency, FEI ratings, EPA per play margin. Michigan only returns 7 percentage points more in returning production, so not a whole lot. And way too early S&P Plus would have Indiana favored by about 8.5 neutral field, 5.5 in Ann Arbor. What Michigan can do here is play the part of Penn State last year, albeit they'd have a superior staff, they'd have a superior offense, and probably a superior defense. This Michigan team will be more engaged and better coached than last season's Penn State team, and there's a chance they'll actually be more talented compared to when Indiana played Penn State. What Penn State was able to do is they were able to blitz and send pressure almost every play and get through. A large part of that had to do with Indiana's naturally weaker pass blocking, which was overly emphasized in that game due to Indiana having offensive line injuries. If Indiana is suffering some of those injuries again, which that happens usually with offensive lines this late in the season, there are occasionally teams that don't have those, but those are very few and far between. If that happens and Daly is healthy and Underwood and Michigan's offense are good enough to get a few scores on some key drives against what I think is going to be a lethal Bryant Haynes defense, you could get a situation where as the game progresses, Michigan's pass rush begins to snowball and they take the lead in the fourth quarter. And maybe, because Omar Cooper Jr. and Fernando Mendoza are gone, there's no longer a very exceptional toe-tap catch with a throw where only your receiver can get it to win the game. Maybe Josh Hoover, his turnover habits come up and he throws a pick in the end zone and Michigan wins. I would favor Indiana here to win. I need to see Michigan play well before picking them to win a game like this preseason until proven otherwise. I'm pretty high in Indiana this year. Also pretty high in Michigan, though. I have them 9th in my early ratings, just like 1/10 of a point ahead of USC. This is going to be a really good game, though. It's a highly touted matchup between two teams, and this could totally be a college football playoff elimination game. Matchup number 6 is Oregon traveling to USC. This has a lot to do, much like with Ohio State against USC, it has to do with travel. And this is the game with the largest predicted point spread that we've talked about so far. Takes place early in the season on September 26th. This will really be the first test for both teams. Oregon might be tested by Oklahoma State. USC could be tested by Rutgers. I don't think either really will, at least to a major degree that will tell us who exactly they are. USC has been living in Oregon's shadow a bit these past few seasons. Both are from the Pac-12. USC's a blue blood, Oregon's a new blood, and Oregon has been acting much more like a blue blood than USC has, to be frank. Last season, Oregon was the better team. Safe to say that. USC was a fair bit worse in certain metrics, FPI, FEI, efficiency. USC would have been a 6-point underdog neutral field per FPI last year, which I do think is strange, and it's probably weighed down by the fact that Oregon had to play Indiana twice. I think that their game in Autzen showed last year that Oregon was the decisively better team. But USC returns quite a bit, and they had to play at Autzen last year. This time they host Oregon in the Collie. So what do we make of this here? Well, what I make of this game is that it is a bit of a program game for USC. It's not a must-win game for USC. USC can lose this game, and then if they beat one of Ohio State or Indiana and win all of their other games, well, then they're in the playoff, and this doesn't really matter. USC also is under significant pressure, though. And if Oregon, say, wins this game by double digits and completely depantses USC in their own house, things get heated pretty quickly, especially when USC has games against Washington and Penn State, the Penn State game being on the road immediately following this former Pac-12 matchup, and I would say current rivalry matchup. USC can return the favor to Oregon, though, by putting pressure on them if they beat Oregon. It would send a bit of concern to Oregon's way if they lost this game to USC, as they would then have a road trip to Ohio State later in the season. They would host Michigan, they would host Washington, and Oregon right here, right now, 2 losses with that regular season schedule would be a bit of a disappointment, and they'd probably have to win it all after that for the season to not be a total failure with the roster that they have, the staff they have, the process that they have. And if USC beats Oregon, who's number 1 in my ratings, well, then there's a pretty damn good chance they're going to beat Ohio State, who has more of a travel problem out to USC, and who preseason doesn't quite have, I would say, the roster at some points that Oregon does, though they're very close. They're much closer together than, say, Oregon is to either of the two. This is a program game, a little bit of a program game. I would have Oregon favored even in the Coliseum by 9.5 points right now. I just think it's a bad matchup for USC. Oregon has to make the travel, but they don't have to change time zones, so the travel won't be as tough. USC's home field advantage is notoriously... it'll probably be pretty good for this game, but it's not like they're traveling to Beaver Stadium cross country, and Oregon did that last year and won that game and could have won it more handily than they did. I love Oregon as a team. I love USC too. This is going to be a pretty tough hill for USC to climb, though, much like against Ohio State. But their hope against Oregon is the same against Ohio State. If their D-line takes a step forward, Oregon's linebackers are a bit shaky after losing Betcher, and they were shaky last year, unlike Ohio State's, and Oregon's O-line's taking a bit to gel, they could take advantage of some of Oregon's weaknesses in those departments with the running back, quarterback, receivers, system, and talent on the defensive line that the Trojans have this season. Next matchup to discuss, Miami at Notre Dame. 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, November 7th on NBC. Notre Dame is favored by 6.5 points. Both of these teams are inside of my top 10, Notre Dame being 6th and Miami being 8th in my early ratings. These teams last year were neck and neck for that final spot in the college football playoff. This could be a playoff elimination game. Probably won't be. I think both of these teams, particularly Notre Dame, are favorites to make the playoff. I have Notre Dame as a lock to make the playoff. I actually have Miami missing it, which will piss some people off in this segment, but oh well. With that schedule, a 10-2 Miami, which happened last year and happened the year before, can actually miss the postseason. They can, especially if their losses are to Notre Dame and another ACC team, and they just don't have any quality wins, and the losses come late enough in the year. Notre Dame lost this game last year because Miami was the better team. I know Notre Dame at the end of the year was pretty much ahead unanimously in ratings across the board. A lot of that, I think, had to do with style of play. Notre Dame was really good at getting explosive plays, both offensively and defensively. Pick sixes, interceptions, long touchdown runs, long touchdown passes. And Miami was more of a slow ball control team. But that's why Miami won the first time around and honestly should have won more by 3. The weather, the travel, and the ability to ball control opponents to death. They really did abuse Notre Dame's offensive line, particularly in the moments they needed to at the end of the game where they had, back-to-back sacks against C.J. Carr. And Notre Dame's defense in that game looked a little bit disheveled, especially when you consider that I don't think Miami's offense was all that free-flowing and all that efficient until probably November or December when they were playing their best football. Notre Dame is first in returning production, and I do think that is a bit inflated because how valuable their running backs were to their system. But they are returning a bit, even if you factor that in. Miami is losing the 3 most important players on their team last year. O-tackle, both DNs. Tony was probably their 4th most important player, so having him back is really key. And they bring back veterans in the secondary. Ahmad Moten Sr. may have been their 5th most important player, certainly top 10. They return him. The loss of Carson Beck and bringing in Darian Mensah is interesting here. I believe Mensah is a higher ceiling quarterback and a better quarterback overall. I also believe that there's a chance his floor could be a shred lower given some of his games at Duke. So I'm curious to see how that pans out. Notre Dame, I'm much more confident in who they are. Much more confident in that. I would say coaching here is pretty even. I have Freeman ahead of Cristobal for now, but they're pretty close. I do believe Miami's coordinators are better, that Heatherman is better than Ash, and while I have Denbrock over Dawson, I just think the average of Miami's coordinators is ahead of Notre Dame's. Miami probably has equivalent or superior position coaches as well. So coaching here is pretty equal. Notre Dame, though, is at home in the month of November, so it's going to be a bit chilly, and there is a huge travel component here. You're not traveling across time zones. They're in the same time zone. But say instead of traveling east to west, you're traveling north to south the same distance. The distance is the same. The time zone change is different, but the overall distance, that's still quite a bit of miles in the air, quite a bit of miles of just sitting in your seat that the other team doesn't exactly have to experience. Still have some jet lag there. So I think that Notre Dame has a bit of an edge in terms of travel. They have the revenge factor here. They'll have a bit of a weather edge. They'll certainly have an experience edge here. In my power ratings, where I'm lower on Notre Dame and Miami than most people are, I have Notre Dame as exactly a 3.5 point favorite, neutral field. So you add 3 on top of that, and the line of Notre Dame minus 6.5 is dead on. That's exactly where I think it is. Notre Dame is fortunate that this game's late in the year, and also I think unfortunate that this game is later in the year. If this game were in week 1 on the road, I'd favor Notre Dame by more than a touchdown here. Miami just has so many new pieces, and with Cristobal, no matter where he is, the team is accustomed to having hiccups. And I think a lot of newness with little in-game experience on the road with the type of coach Cristobal is would be a bad matchup against this Notre Dame team for Miami. So on the one hand, you get the weather edge later in the year, and I think Notre Dame's a bit deeper. So maybe you also get the injury bug that goes in your favor. You also could get a scenario, though, where Miami, as they get to build experience throughout several games against inferior competition, starts clicking at the right time again and can go on the road and win this game, which would be a huge program win. With both of these schedules being so pedestrian and weak, and both of these coaches being known for complete coaching meltdowns in games that you do not expect, this could be a playoff elimination game. It also could be a program elimination game. If either of these teams loses 3 games this year, especially Notre Dame, it would be an utter disaster, especially for Notre Dame. And for Miami, I think it would be a bit of a disaster too. Both of these teams are heavy favorites to make the college football playoff. There's a chance that due to losing this game, one of them misses it entirely. Indiana at Washington. This is game 8. This is the second to last week of the regular season. Indiana here could already be a playoff lock. They could also have 2 losses to Michigan and Ohio State, or throw in USC in the mix in 2 of the 3, and they could be fighting for a spot. Washington could be in the same position, hypothetically, because they don't play Oregon or Indiana until the end of the year when they play them back-to-back, which sucks. But outside of that, they don't play Michigan or Ohio State, and they play USC on the road, but again, same time zone. So you have a long travel, but at least you don't have the change in time that's so severe. And it's a sandwich game for USC in between their game against Oregon and Penn State. Washington's schedule's uber advantageous until you get to this point. There is a world where Washington here is undefeated, or only has 1 loss or maybe 2, and they as well are fighting for a spot in the CFP. So this is for sure a CFP elimination game. I have Indiana second in my ratings, and Washington 13th. But guess what spread I have for this game? Type below in the comments section for a second. This game has a spread in my very humble opinion, of 7.5 points. Indiana favored by 7.5 here. That's the spread I have for this game. And that is because I have Washington 13th in my ratings. I view them very highly. And it's a cross-country game. I mean, Ohio State was only favored by single digits over Washington last year, I believe. Oregon was too. Washington was undefeated at home in 2024. And Washington returns DeMond Williams in a defense last year that was top 15 to close out the season. They were a defensive team last year. Their offense wasn't really good in big games, but that defense holding Ohio State and Oregon and Michigan and Wisconsin to the point totals they did when the offense couldn't do anything was pretty impressive. Ryan Walters is a top 10 defensive coordinator in college football. Jed Fish is a good offensive mind. So you have a good staff. You have a good roster. You have a travel edge. Washington, if they are winning, is going to pack that stadium. And it's going to be loud. It's going to be rowdy. That's a stadium that can, much like Autzen, because they're built and designed to produce and enhance noise. That's a stadium environment that could break a team if Washington plays well, that could break their opponent. It could be the sole reason why they end up winning. Like Ohio State traveling to Oregon a few years ago. With hindsight, if that game's played anywhere but Autzen and the crowd is any bit different, Ohio State definitely wins that game. You could tell as the game progressed that the crowd really began like digging into Ohio State's head. It caused Will Howard to fumble the snap and kind of just take a sack, which gave Oregon a valuable punt. And I think it disheveled Howard a bit too, which caused him to slide with 0 seconds left. You could have a moment like that here when Indiana travels to face Washington. You could also have a moment where we talked about earlier in Michigan how they could have a pass rush edge against Indiana, or how Penn State last year had that similar edge, or Iowa. And Washington's able to get Indiana in a very nitty-gritty matchup where it's going to come down to the final seconds in the game. Indiana also has good enough coaching, and I think a deeper roster this year. Sure, they could just go up and spank Washington. But I think more likely than not, this is going to be a competitive game, at least for a half or three quarters, than a dominant win. At the very best, Indiana is going to travel and beat Washington the way Ohio State or Oregon did last year. At the very worst, it could be Indiana versus Penn State or Iowa 2.0 last year, except Indiana comes away with a one-score loss. We have our first only SEC matchup here in Texas traveling to LSU. Texas is third in my ratings. LSU is 12th. I have this game as about a 7-point line in favor of Texas here. This is a playoff elimination game. Same theme as all the other games we've discussed so far, with the exception of a few of the first at the beginning of the series. Texas has a loaded team. So does LSU. Both of these head coaches, I think, have coaching questions entering this season, questions about winning the big games. They are in very early S&P Plus, within 4 points of each other. So according to preseason S&P Plus, this could be a pick'em when it kicks off on November 14th. It will be an afternoon or night game at Death Valley too. So you have to take that into account. Last season, Texas was just good. LSU is pretty much average, maybe above average at the very best. They weren't even top 25 in FPI despite all the talent they had, because the defense was top 15, maybe top 10 at points during the year, and the offense was just putrid and honestly playing at an Iowa level of offense. LSU's going to really improve from last year. In my mind, they're a lock to be a top 15 team. I have Texas as a lock to be top 15, or top 10, rather, with a more likely than not chance to be a top 5 program and top 5 team. So it's going to be a battle between two teams that really disappointed last year and have made huge strides, But due to some games on their schedule and due to the fact they play each other, the loser of this game is probably out of the college football playoff, I would say. Texas has enough games against Ohio State, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Missouri, Florida, Ole Miss. Were to lose this game against LSU, where I think Texas is the better team, especially if I'm correct that LSU is a top 15 team but not a top 10 team, they probably have lost one or even two more of those other games by the end of the season. If LSU loses this game, well, they have games against Alabama, they have games against A&M, Clemson at the beginning of the year, they have to play Auburn on the road, Tennessee on the road. If they lose this game, there's a chance they have 3 losses. Their win total's at 8.5 overall. So it's another game between two great offensive minds, two fantastic rosters, a point spread that is a touchdown or under, so it's projected to be a close win for either side, that will determine the college football playoff field. And the last game I want to talk about is Michigan at Ohio State, the game, where Ohio State's favored by 11.5 points. I have Michigan as about a 6 point, maybe 7 point underdog against Ohio State neutral field, so they're 9 to 10 point underdogs at Columbus. I understand the line being at 11.5 though, because typically in the game, the team who wins handily, and it's very, I would say very clear during the game who the better team is, even when it ends up being a close competitive contest. And even if the worst team occasionally wins in this game, it's clear who the better team is, and usually that results in snowballing, as we've seen in several games in the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s. Even if one team takes an early lead, or even if in the very rare occasion the inferior team wins the game, it is known at the end of the game who the better team is. And Ohio State this season, for the first time I would say, looking at preseason data and trying to make honest, objective projections about which team is, I think Ohio State finally has the meta advantage here for probably the first time since 2020. Last year they had it with hindsight, and they had it entering the game a little bit on game day, but preseason there was no indication that they were going to have a definitive edge in the metagame. After all, they didn't really run the football that well last year. Michigan was the better run team. Ohio State was just the way better team overall, better staff, and they had the much better run defense. This season, I expect Michigan to improve in offense, including running the ball. I also expect Ohio State to make strides there too. And while I do expect Ohio State to take a step back and run defense with how much they're losing up the middle, Patricia's damn good. Their roster is damn good. They're still going to have elite players on that side of the ball, and the game's in Columbus. It's not in Ann Arbor. If this game were in Ann Arbor, there'd be a good chance I'd actually pick Michigan preseason to win. But it's in C-Bus, and I'm not picking Ohio State to lose a game in C-Bus unless it's to a team that I have power rated over them definitively. This year that would be Oregon. So, it being a noon game, the winner of this game is usually the better team, usually the team that has several matchup edges, and usually the team who wins this game snowballs the loser towards the end. I would strongly favor Ohio State here. Even though my model would say that Michigan should cover, I'd be conflicted on whether to actually pick that or not. But here's the path for Michigan to win. The path for Ohio State to win is simple because they won last year and quite decisively. And their returning production is similar, and they play host. Michigan's path to win pretty much is predicated on Ohio State not taking a huge step forward in rushing offense. It's predicated on the expected drop-off on defense, which I think is very likely to happen, but it probably needs to be a bit more severe than I think it will be. It's also predicated on Michigan fixing their special teams issues, Bryce Underwood fixing himself up as a quarterback, both in mechanics, in decision-making, in the staff utilizing him better. It relies on probably Michigan calling a better game than Ohio State, too. And while I love Michigan's staff, and I think it's criminally underrated by everyone, including by Michigan fans, including by biased Michigan fans, even those who are picking Michigan to win the Big Ten when that probably won't happen, They're doing it because they think the roster is more loaded than it is. They probably still don't understand the coaching upgrade that they received, especially since those type of fans were saying that Sharon Moore was a good coach. I love Michigan's staff. There is a world in parts where I think it's better than Ohio State's, but in parts. As a complete staff, there's no objective way to say that Michigan's staff is better than Ohio State's now. And that also goes with the roster. Again, in parts, Michigan is better parts, but if you have 2 bins of Legos, one bin of Legos has a chance to have some higher quality pieces. That doesn't mean that bin is the higher quality bin than the other set of Legos. And Ohio State's set of Legos is just better than Michigan's set of Legos. So it's a key game. It's the best rivalry in sports history. It is a game that is going to have hatred renewed. It will be a better game than last year's because Michigan's going to take big steps forward, and Ohio State would have to take massive, unfathomable steps back for this to not be a better game than it was last year. And Ohio State, they're either going to take some steps back, a step forward, they're going to be the same. They're not going to be this 8-4, 7-5 caliber team like Michigan was last year. They just had an easy schedule, so that's why they went 9-3. That's my 10th best game. That's my top 10 matchups for the 2026 season. Some honorable mentions before we get it out of here. Oklahoma versus Texas. Oklahoma versus Georgia. Michigan at Oregon. That game I only didn't put on here because Oregon was favored by 18.5 points in my model. Ohio State at Iowa. USC at Indiana. USC at Penn State. Florida, Georgia. Georgia, Alabama. Would also love to shout out... I would say LSU Ole Miss would be another one as well. We're going to be doing a video in the future discussing the top 10 matchups in terms of entertainment, which will look totally different from this list, so stay tuned for that, along with storyline matchups. Okay, that segment took way longer than I wanted it to, because it took like 45 minutes, and I only wanted to do 20 minutes on it. This tougher schedule one should be much easier, though, because we're only talking about one team. We're talking about their schedule. Yeah, I mean, this has been a pretty fun video for me so far. Pretty fun live show. And we have a lot of concurrent viewers in here. So let me see what all of you are thinking about this video. A question about whether I would rather get hit by Ray Lewis or Sean Taylor. I don't know enough about those players to choose. I'd rather not be hit by either of them. Okay, Lincoln Riley getting his hardest schedule in his make or break year is crazy. That is the perfect comment to read before we get started with this top 10 schedules list, because USC's in here, and they're not just in the top 10, they're in the top 5 of my toughest college football schedules in 2026. Who has the toughest path in college football this fall? Whether to the national title, the college football playoff, or to 10 wins? Let me know down below who has the toughest path in the sport. Because today, I'm going to be giving you my top 10 schedules for the fall, and how I determine the top 10 schedules is I take a look at all the Power 4 teams, I take a look at my power ratings for those Power 4 teams, and I add up the power rating of the Power 4 opponents on those schedules, factor in travel, factor in home field advantage, how many road games you play, how many home games you play, and, well... my equation spits out a number, and that's how I organize my top 10. So, enough with that. Let's get into it here. Ohio State has the toughest schedule by a mile in my schedule model. It's quite insane. Number one, when you factor in travel and home games and away games in the power leagues, Ohio State has a disadvantage there. They don't break even in terms of the points they would get for hosting games or playing games on the road, or they don't, their travel isn't broken even. So what I mean by that is traveling to USC puts you down several points, but hosting Oregon brings you up several points because you're putting Oregon at a huge travel disadvantage. You're getting an extra edge over that team. They slightly have a disadvantage here in terms of just the location of their games because of playing at USC, playing at Iowa, playing at Texas, playing at Nebraska. They have several games, at least one time zone or multiple time zones over, that require long flights. And they don't get many of those teams traveling their way, Oregon and Illinois being, the biggest examples of that. They also play the only 3 teams in college football I have ranked ahead of them: Texas, Indiana, and Oregon in my power ratings. They play those 3 teams, 2 of them on the road. No one else plays that collection of 3 all at once. The only world where someone does is in postseason play. No one else, no one. No one plays Oregon, Indiana, and Texas in the same season. Nada. And they play Michigan and USC as well, who I have top 10. So Ohio State in my book is playing 5 top 10 power rated teams, and 3 of them are on the road. On top of that, they play Iowa on the road, and Iowa I have 17th in my ratings. So half of their schedule are top 20 teams, and if you only count Power 4 teams, half of their Power 4 teams are against the top 10. In my metrics, Ohio State's schedule is as far away from the number 2 schedule in America as the number 2 schedule in America is as far away from the number 12 schedule. That's the gap between number 1 and number 2. That being Ohio State, and we'll talk about the number 2 schedule in just a minute here. Ball State at Texas, Kent State at home. Those are the first 3 games of the season. After that, Ohio State hosts Illinois, travels to Iowa, hosts Maryland, travels to Indiana. They get a bye on October 24th, then they travel to USC, host Oregon and Northwestern back-to-back, travel to Nebraska, and end the season with the greatest rivalry in sports history, the game hosting Michigan on November 28th at noon. This is the toughest schedule in America, and it's why Ohio State's win total is at 9.5 when everyone is betting they're over, when they're the consensus number 1 preseason, and at the same time they're the favorite to win it all. That's why their win total's at 9.5, despite every other indicator telling you they will win 10 or 11 games, because the schedule's that tough. I have Ohio State, for context, power rated 4th. I am lower on them than some, but also higher on them than others. I'm actually higher on them than Chris Drew and some other Buckeyes I know. But this schedule is brutal. So kudos to Ohio State for not canceling that Texas game, because if they did, it would probably be beneficial to their college football playoff odds. And it's going to be interesting to see if Ohio State continues that streak of not losing 3 games since 2011. In the regular season, in general, postseason, it's probably unlikely. They probably will lose 3 games, just counting their regular season and postseason. But even then, it's Ohio State. They've reloaded before. They will do it again. The question is, to what degree do they reload? And also, how good are the teams on this schedule? Are they as good as I think they will be? Will they be worse? There's a world where some of them are actually even better than I think they will be. Regardless, it's the toughest schedule in college football by quite a bit. Number 2 is Michigan. Michigan, I mentioned earlier, their schedule is as far behind as Ohio State's, as Purdue's schedule, which is the 12th toughest in my model, is behind Michigan's. That's the gap between number 1 and number 2. So we're lowering ourselves into a totally different tier of schedule now. And that is because Michigan plays Oregon, Ohio State, and Indiana, who are 3 of my top 4 teams, but they don't play USC, for example. Instead, they play Oklahoma at home. They get Iowa at home instead of on the road. And there you have it. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have 6 teams power rated top 20, much like Ohio State. But if you look inside the top 10, you only have 3 instead of 5. And you get, 4. Actually, I think I counted bad math here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, I was correct in saying 6. You get 4 of those top 20 games at home. Only 2 of them on the road. You get 1 of the top 10 teams at home, 2 of them on the road in Oregon and Ohio State. It's a very tough schedule, but it is made easier by the fact that Michigan only plays a convenient 4 road games, and 2 of them are against Rutgers and Minnesota. They also have a travel edge on their schedule, where Oklahoma has to travel quite a bit to get to Michigan this time. Iowa has to travel some. Penn State, a little bit. They have to travel to Oregon, yes, but that's also made up for the fact that UCLA has to travel the equivalent amount of time zones over to make up for that. And traveling to Ohio State for either Ohio State or Michigan is a cakewalk. Playing there isn't. But traveling there, well, it's actually kind of a short drive or an even shorter flight. Michigan's win total at 8.5 makes sense here. They face one of the toughest schedules in college football. I'm lower on them than a lot of Michigan fans are, from what I can tell. Probably higher on them than others or non-Michigan fans, with the exception of a few. The schedule's a huge part of it. I largely think Michigan is going to go 9-3, and if not 9-3, 8-4. And I think it tracks when you compare with Ohio State, where I think Ohio State, their most likely record probability-wise is 9-3. I'm picking them for now 10-2, and if not that, I then think they will go 9-3. I think Ohio State's basically a whole game better than Michigan, or a game and a half, but with a tougher schedule, it levels out to a game when comparing them with the schedules that they have. Michigan's a good team. They're a great team this year, from my perspective. That schedule is a titan, and if Michigan just wins 10 games with this schedule, Michigan fans should be about as elated with Michigan as they were with the 2021 team. It would be a huge sign that things are heading in the right direction under Kyle Whittingham and company. I will caution people, though, if Michigan goes 9-3 with this schedule, that's not a failure. That would also be a success. 8-4 and worse is when you get to a point where there's a bad taste in your mouth. But if Michigan goes 9-3 here, that means they beat all the teams they should beat, basically anyone who's not top 10 and they only lost to the top 10, or they beat one of the top 10 teams and lost to an Oklahoma, Iowa, Penn State, or maybe in a very weird game on the road. And either of those outcomes are good with the second toughest schedule in college football. USC is the third toughest schedule in college football, only behind Michigan due to the non-conference game, because they have a harder travel situation than the Wolverines do. First and foremost, they play 5 road games. Michigan only plays 4. They also have to travel to Rutgers, to Penn State, to Wisconsin, and to Indiana. And they only have games against Maryland and Ohio State that make up for that. So they have a disadvantage in travel situations, for sure. The reason, despite a much severe travel disadvantage compared to the prior 2 teams we've talked about, Ohio State and Michigan, they have a cakewalk of a non-con schedule, and they get 2 byes. So that's helpful. If they played Notre Dame, and say they substitute out one of the G5 teams for Notre Dame, I will tell you guys right now, they would, in my model, have the toughest schedule in college football. They and Ohio State would be in the same tier of ungodly tough, and USC would edge them out by maybe a point or so. So I hate that they dropped that Notre Dame game, but in a do-or-die year for Lincoln Riley, or a year where maybe it's not quite do-or-die, but you're starting to border on it, having 4 top 6 teams and that travel schedule would have been absolute hell to deal with. Would have been absolute hell to deal with. Would have been awful. So at the same time, I understand why they did it, even though I hate it and I think it's wrong. That's up to college football at large to fix that problem. So their conference schedule is at Rutgers, Oregon and Washington home back-to-back, at Penn State. They get byes on October 17th and November 7th. In between those byes, they play at Wisconsin and host Ohio State. They travel to Indiana after the second bye and then host Maryland before traveling to UCLA. There are a lot of trippy games on this schedule. Every game on here that I see outside of Maryland at home is losable for USC. At the same time, I think every game except for the road trip to Indiana, and maybe one of Oregon or Ohio State at home, but I think there's enough of a world where they win those where they're winnable. They only have one game in which they have a guaranteed win in Big Ten play. They also only have one guaranteed loss. So there's a lot of variance for this team. The tough schedule is going to test them. They're going to have to improve handily as a quality of team this year to win 8 or even 9 games. Last year's team, with how they operated in looking at this schedule, I will tell you what last year's team would have done with this schedule. They would have lost to Oregon, Ohio State, probably to Indiana too, and one of Penn State, one of Washington, one of UCLA would have been a loss as well. They would have won 8-4 or 7-5. Last year's team would have with this schedule. So in order to reach their win total, which is set at 8.5, that means the books expect significant improvement. I do as well. Much like Michigan, if they go 9-3, I think the season's kind of a success because that means you either beat everyone you should, and Riley's never done that, so that would be a step forward, or you don't do that, and maybe a loss to Wisconsin, Rutgers, or UCLA is the fan base wanting to assassinate one of the coaches, but then you beat one of the big teams, Ohio State or Oregon, and that's also something Riley's never done before. So, much like Michigan, I just want to say 9-3 with those teams is not a failure. Even with a team like Ohio State, if they go 9-3, that would be a failure due to the level they've been playing at, but it would not be a colossal failure due to the toughness of the schedule. It would be uncomfortable, it would be unfortunate, but especially with it, the playoff likely expanding and schedules getting tougher than ever for the Big Ten and SEC, 9-3 is pretty much like the new 10-2 in a way. For Arkansas, who I have as the 4th toughest schedule, we're not going to talk about them that long because I don't think they're going to be very good. But listen to some of these games they have to play. At Utah, I think they're a top 25 team. Georgia at home, I have them as a top 5 team. At Texas A&M, have them top 25. Tennessee at home, have them top 30. Vanderbilt on the road, that's a tricky game. And then off the bye, Missouri, top 25 team. At Auburn, top 30 team, about there. South Carolina could always pop. At Texas, I have them top 5. LSU at home, I have them top 15. And their win total's 4.5. I'm not high on Ryan Silverfield, and they face plenty of quality coaches and rosters who are better than them in those categories. That trip particular to Utah puts them at enough of a travel disadvantage and can really start the season off with a sour note where, I'm not saying this is likely, but maybe Ryan Silverfield's a one and done. Maybe. We'll see. I mean, with that schedule, I wouldn't put it past him. Oklahoma, I have them as the 5th toughest schedule. And again, Ohio State was in their own tier. There isn't going to be a point in this video where we're dropping into the next tier. Maybe in a little bit there's a drop in tier from 6 to 7, but it's not by as much as the drop from number 1 to number 2. Oklahoma's schedule explains their 7.5 win total. Completely explains it. They get UTEP in September 5th, or on September 5th. But after that, they have to travel to Michigan. Noon game. Road trip to a team with a much better staff than they had last year. Then they host New Mexico. Then they have to travel to Georgia. Off their bye, they play Texas neutral field. Then they host Kentucky, travel to Mississippi State, host South Carolina, travel to Florida, host Ole Miss, and host Texas A&M. Have to travel to Missouri. Oklahoma has a travel and home versus away game disadvantage, a unique one. And look, I mean, Michigan last year, if their defenders could just catch the ball, and Underwood was maybe in year 2 and not year 1, Michigan probably wins that game. They had close affairs with Auburn, LSU, who just were not very good, even before their coaches got fired. And now this team, which does return a lot, and I do think from a ratings standpoint will be better this year than last year, had to travel to Michigan, to Georgia. They have to face a Texas team who's traditionally owned them, and Texas is also getting better. They have to travel to Florida. Ole Miss beat them last year in their house. They have to travel to Missouri, and they have a game against Texas A&M. And Texas A&M is a good coach in Mike Elko and a good program, and they're talented. So it's much like Michigan and USC here. If Oklahoma goes 9-3 and misses the playoffs, season is far from a failure. far from a failure, especially since the Brent Venables track record has been 6-6, 10-2, 6-6, 10-2. If Oklahoma doesn't severely regress and they don't do the whole up-down theory confirmation bias thing that they've been doing the past 4 years, to see some consistency year over year would be a success. To go over this win total with this schedule, I think would be at least a push for the Brent Venables regime, and going a game and a half over or more, 9-3 or better, would be an absolute success. I'm pretty high in Oklahoma's defense to reload. I like their starting offensive line. My questions for them pretty much revolve around John Mateer and revolve around how good their sides of the football are against teams like Texas or Georgia. Like, are they going to be competitive in those games against those type of teams and those type of athletes, or are they going to continue to get depantsed as they have been in past seasons, with maybe the exception of 2023 when they beat a Texas team that went to the 4-team college football playoff? Ole Miss, another SEC team with a win total at 7.5, and this is the 6th toughest schedule in college football, in my humble opinion. Starting out the season with a new staff, part of a new roster, and having to play Jeff Brom in Louisville is evil. That is, I would wish that on my worst enemy, depending on how good my worst enemy is. And if my worst enemy were a team like Ole Miss, I would wish that on them. Clev Lubin and Lincoln Keenholz and Isaac and Keon Brown and the system that Brom runs against that new staff, Louisville's going to win that game. Not locking it in as a guarantee. I just think right now Louisville's going to win that game. That's a tough game to start out with. And then to host Charlotte is kind of a bye you have before hosting LSU September 19th on a 7:30 p.m. kickoff. Last year, Ole Miss won that game, but Ole Miss had the better staff and the much better team than LSU did, and it was still competitive. This season, LSU's probably going to have the better team and probably the better staff. We'll just see if the hatred and if Ole Miss having the better quarterback is enough to change that. And then having to play at Florida before your bye in week 5. You already play 3 top 25 games before your first bye, and your first bye leaves you with 8 games remaining on your schedule that include a road trip to Vanderbilt, hosting Missouri, traveling to Texas, hosting Auburn, hosting Georgia, playing at Oklahoma. Wofford is basically your bye game before hosting Mississippi State in the Egg Bowl, November 27th at noon. For Ole Miss to have a win total of 7.5 with this schedule, I mean, damn, that's respect from the models and from the books. Because I'm not impressed with Ole Miss's staff right now. I am impressed with their defensive line. I'm impressed with, particularly at defensive end. I like Eccles at tackle, but I don't think they're particularly deep there. I am impressed with their DNs and pass rushers, though. I'm impressed with their tight end group as long as Haz can get healthy. I'm impressed, obviously, with Lacey at running back and Chambliss at QB. Very much impressed with parts of their roster. Staff, completeness of said roster, and how they'll handle this schedule, that is a different question entirely. Mississippi State has my 7th toughest schedule. So we've had 4 SEC teams in a row after 3 Big Ten teams in a row. You could say there's a little bit of a drop-off here from number 6 to number 7, but it's not super, super noticeable. Mississippi State's win total's at 4.5. It's about where I view them right now. The trickiest thing for Mississippi State is that they have to travel to Minnesota on September 12th. And if you're Mississippi State and you're trying to get your, if you're trying to, put your clothes on, if you're trying to get off the tarmac, why would you schedule that game, especially on the road? I mean, good for you. Good for the sport of college football. We need to mandate games like this. But while they're not mandated, I think actually the SEC does mandate at least not one Power 4 game at a conference. So I would understand that. But why would the SEC even make that mandate in the current climate, I guess is my point. At Minnesota and then at South Carolina back-to-back, 2 games where Minnesota, you're traveling a lot north-south, and then you're traveling across a time zone and a lot east-west to get to South Carolina. That's brutal. And then to host Missouri and host Alabama back-to-back, brutal too. Off the bye, they travel to LSU, host Oklahoma, travel to Texas, host Vanderbilt and Auburn back-to-back, and they get a bye in an FCS game against Tennessee Tech on November 21st before traveling to Ole Miss on November 27th. Totally get this win total of 4.5 here. Totally get it, especially with all that Mississippi State is losing and the massive roster turnover they yet again have as they did last season. Northwestern has my 8th toughest schedule, and they were very, very close to Mississippi State. Some would have them as even tougher than I do. The only reason I didn't have them higher than this is they do play Ohio State, Oregon, and Indiana all on the road, but outside of those teams in Iowa, they don't play another top 25 team. Well, they do play Penn State. So they play 5 top 20 teams. Michigan and Ohio State play 6. USC, for context, they play 6 as well. With Northwestern, it really came down to the fact that I don't view Colorado as that much better than a G5 team. I just don't. Ball State's a G5 team. South Dakota State is pretty, they're an FCS team, obviously. And they do have a tough schedule in that they have a week 2 bye, and that's brutal. And maybe I should take into account that, and I could always redo these top 10 schedule rankings before the season. But I'm not high on Illinois. I'm not high on Rutgers. I'm not high on Michigan State. Obviously not high on Colorado. Minnesota, I'm kind of wait and see on. So if they win their 3 non-conference games, if Northwestern's simply an average team, they could easily get to 6 or 7 wins. Meanwhile, just an average team, I feel, with Michigan or Ohio State's schedule could not easily get to 6 or 7 wins. Northwestern's schedule might be the toughest if you're trying to get to 11 wins or 12, because you have to play 3 of my top 4 teams on the road. And that right there, I think, is the toughest 3-game sample in all of college football that we have on a schedule, is those 3 teams on the road. Not 3 as in they have to be all back-to-back, but just picking out 3, the toughest 3 games from any schedule in college football. I think Northwestern would win that. But if you're looking at the bottom end of the bell curve on this schedule, I just think there's a lot at that left tail there. And then it rapidly goes up once you start reaching, once you get past the middle of that trend, then it rapidly begins to increase as you get to, playing at Oregon, playing at Ohio State, playing at Indiana. But outside of that and the bye, it is a very, very tough schedule. Of course, not quite as tough as an Ohio State caliber schedule, though. But certainly fighting for anyone within that really 2 to 10 range, as all those are closer together than Michigan at number 2 is to Ohio State at number 1 in terms of schedule toughness. Just listen to this, though. After their week 2 bye, they host Colorado, play at Indiana, host Penn State, they host Ball State, travel to Michigan State, host Rutgers, travel to Oregon, host Iowa. Having to get Iowa at home in between Oregon and Ohio State on the road is just brutal. And after Ohio State on the road, they play at Minnesota and Illinois at home. What a brutal stretch for Northwestern. Absolutely brutal. The reason it's not higher than this is I'm not taking into account team quality when I grade strength of schedule beyond the fact that they don't have to play themselves, for example. So if Ohio State had to play their schedule or Northwestern's, I don't know exactly which they would prefer, especially since they'd have to play more top teams on the road in this schedule than they do on their own, but they'd have much easier home games, for example. So they'd probably take, as long as you could substitute maybe Penn State or Iowa for Michigan, they'd probably take this schedule over the one that they have, at least by the metrics that I'm using. Michigan State has the 9th toughest. Talk about a hell of a year. You lose your school president, you lose your AD. It's year 1 under a coach who's known for long, painful rebuilds. And you got a schedule that's top 10 in toughness, and you have road games against Wisconsin, Notre Dame, UCLA, Michigan, and Rutgers. Wow. Tough time to be a Spartan, man. Really tough time to be a Spartan. Again, the only reason this isn't higher on the list, at least for me, is they avoid Ohio State and they avoid Indiana. They also get Oregon at home. They don't have to play them on the road. They also avoid USC. So they do get a lot of the middle of the road, even bottom tier Big Ten teams outside of really Michigan, Oregon, and Washington. But having that Notre Dame game on the road in conference play is rough. If they replace Notre Dame with a G5 team, they would be top 25 in strength of schedule. They'd be like 25th or 24th, maybe even 26th instead of 9th. That Notre Dame game means a lot because instead of scheduling possibly an auto win, you're likely scheduling an auto loss, which is really going to shake up strength of schedule rankings. I'm glad the Megaphone Trophy is back. It is a traditional rivalry with how much Michigan State has had in terms of roster turnover and how long it's been since they've played. I don't know if you're going to get many rivalry antics in this game exactly, and Notre Dame will probably win that game in a blowout. Florida has the 10th toughest schedule. And just some omissions to go over that I was really conflicted about: Nebraska, Purdue, Texas, Texas A&M, Oregon, Washington, Kentucky, South Carolina, and Auburn. Those teams all were 11th through 20th. I didn't give you the order, but they were somewhere in between 11th and 20th in terms of strength of schedule. And many of them were, like, all of them were actually closer to Florida than, or almost as close to Florida, except for South Carolina and Auburn, than Florida was to Ohio State. So there is a drop-off somewhere in that top 20 that's quite steep. Florida, their schedule's very tough. I do think in terms of matchups and quality of team they play that it is almost as advantageous as you could get for a tough schedule. I have Florida in my way too early predictions making the college football playoff, and after looking at these schedule rankings, I might pull back on that. I will still be higher on them than most are, but you look at Florida Atlantic and Campbell at home, that's easy, but then having to travel to Auburn, switching a time zone, traveling multiple states, it's a long flight, and Auburn's going to be a good team. Ole Miss at home won't be a cakewalk. Missouri on the road, that's even longer travel, that won't be a cakewalk. South Carolina at home, I think will be a cakewalk, but that's because I'm not high on South Carolina. At Texas, it's another long trip. Every other weekend, they're having a long flight, a whole time zone over, and the distance between Gainesville and Texas is as long as some teams having to travel 2 time zones over. Same with traveling to Missouri. They have to go back home to play at least a decent opponent. Off the bye, they get Georgia in a neutral field. They host Oklahoma. Then they have to travel to Kentucky, play Vanderbilt, and play at Florida State. The toughest part of their schedule is late September and October. About the early middle of their schedule is the toughest. If they can get through that with only 1 or 2 losses, like if they come out of the Georgia game and they only have 2 losses, their odds to make the college football playoff are fairly high, and I still like that. But this schedule's tough. I like the roster they have, but they have enough holes, and many teams in the schedule have enough strengths, like Texas. I have them 3rd in my ratings. I have Georgia 5th in my ratings. Oklahoma is 11th. Auburn, Ole Miss, Missouri, they're all top 30. And Kentucky and Florida State, I have as above average college football teams. Not above average Power 4 teams, but teams that would be favored over the vast majority of G5 teams. And they're both teams on the road. And Vanderbilt's tricky with that staff, and they bring back some nice players too, like Jordan Matthews at corner or Cedric Alexander. Some of the wide receivers they have are pretty nice. So it's a tough schedule. And these top 10 schedules are ones that can make or break any teams on here. All the teams who I would view as locks to make the college football playoff are very close. There are some of them inside the top 20 or very close to being inside the top 20. None of them, though, are inside of this top 10. None of these teams in my top 10 strengths of schedule or top 10 strongest schedules, I believe, are playoff locks. There's one team in here who I would pencil in the college football playoff, and I think they're likely to make it, and that's Ohio State. But outside of that, the rest of these teams either have no shot to make the playoffs or they're underdogs to make the college football playoff. Just so much of making the playoffs So much of winning the national title, not as much now because there's more margin for error, but especially back then, so much of it was strength of schedule, winning your close games, the timing of your, like, just all these different things. And these teams just have gauntlet after gauntlet, big game after big game to get through. I'm really fascinated to see how they handle this. I mean, there is a good chance that no team inside of this top 10 makes the playoff. And that's pretty bold when you have Oklahoma, USC, Michigan, and especially when you have Ohio State in this list. But Ohio State, Michigan, USC, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, those are all schedules where you're playing multiple top 10, top 15 teams week in, week out, and you don't really get a break. You might have a brief break that's nicely timed, but you have to play about half of your schedule as top 25 caliber opponents, and 33% of your schedule in some cases, or even more, being opponents inside the top 10. That's really tough. So respect to these teams for playing these schedules. I do expect your national champion to not come from this bracket in most seasons. Ohio State could always bust that, and I would pay attention to Florida and Oklahoma, USC and Michigan to potentially make the playoffs despite being on this list. As for a team who could make noise, who's very underrated preseason, not in terms of the playoff, but maybe pulling off an upset or playing a big team close, I'd pay attention to the Northwestern Wildcats. Okay, we've been live for an hour and a half. The good news is the vast majority of this video is pretty much already done, I would say. And yeah, that took about 30 minutes. Okay, cool. So, first and foremost, I need to get a drink of water. And I probably need to get at least like something to eat because I am starving after both of those segments. So, stay tuned, everyone. I'm going to take a 5-10 minute break. We will be back, and the topic, as you can obviously see, is me criticizing some people, or at least critiquing them positively, in saying that, you know, any program can be Indiana if they just take themselves seriously, or searching for who the next Indiana will be. After that, we're talking about Julian Sayin and how he can be the #1 quarterback in college football, what Lincoln Riley needs to do to succeed, whether Nebraska will be better or worse this year, some breaking topics about Michigan State and Texas Tech that will release as videos right after this live is done, and a bold prediction about Michigan and Bryce Underwood. We will see you very shortly. Again, 5-10 minute break, no later. We'll be right back. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it. I think that was like 12 minutes or so. See how many of you are still on. Oh, quite a bit of you. Thank you for sticking around. I appreciate it a lot. Some breaking news. Tom Izzo had some comments talking about how disgusted he was at how Michigan State, in his opinion, lost the best president that may have ever been there, or one of the best. And he seems pretty angry and frustrated with the board of trustees. And Utah's attorney general has joined in with Oklahoma's and Kansas's for backing the Big 12 and threatening to join in with them in fighting Texas Tech and the Attorney General of Texas, Ken Paxton, in something we'll talk about in a minute, where the Big 12 is basically trying to bar Ken Paxton and Texas Tech from preventing the Big 12 from enforcing their rules, which would be fining Texas Tech or preventing them from playing in the conference championship game, possibly even more, if they don't bench Brendan Sorsby due to the, his gambling addiction and all of that different controversy. But first and foremost, this has been a topic that I wanted to talk about last week. Didn't get to. So, had to burp there. Apologies. We didn't get to it last week. We can now get to it now. I was listening to the Kirkwood and Dunn show, a short that they had, where, and because YouTube Shorts are YouTube Shorts, things can be unintentionally taken into context, but they were basically saying that, Minnesota with PJ Fleck, the only thing holding them back from greatness is PJ Fleck. And I do agree with that in some principle. But there's another principle, another idea that pops in my head where I think, no, not any program can do what Indiana just did. Maybe now the door is open, hypothetically, for any program to, but acting like any of them could, it's so statistically improbable that we shouldn't go there. So that's what this topic is going to be about. It's a mistake to think that any college football program can achieve what Indiana did in 2025 and 2024, let alone that any college football program can compete for a national championship because of what Indiana did. That's a mistake. And I've heard this from different people. I've heard from Joel Klatt, for example, using Indiana winning it all as the evidence behind him saying this is the golden age of college football. And I've heard other people say, even many I respect and who are much smarter and better at this than I am, say that Indiana winning it all and completing the greatest story in college football history with Curt Cignetti, Fernando Mendoza, D'Angelo Pons, and many others who played their final season as champions, using that, citing that as a reason why college football is at its peak right now. It's at its golden age, and it's never been better. And I think a lot of that is misguided, but depending on your perspective and what you weigh in your equation that determines how good college football is, I guess that's possible, for sure. And I do think college football right now has a lot of health to it. The problem is that could be very fleeting if things aren't taken care of, but that's not what this segment's about. This segment is about the idea that now that we have more competitive balance in the Power 2 leagues, in the Power 4 leagues, that all of a sudden, just because there's more opportunity means that the floor has been drastically raised, or means that anyone can take advantage of that opportunity. Because I don't think that's the case, and I want to dive into why that's not the case. Not any program can become or do what Indiana has done over the past 2 seasons. Why is that, Sam? Well, Indiana went from being a program that was recruiting occasionally inside the top 50, but mostly outside the top 60, to competing for top 30, top 40 classes This season, they could even get a top 25 class, which would be pretty incredible. And a team that went from winning an average of 3 games per season and losing an average of 8 games per season under the final 3 years of Tom Allen to, and before then when the Big Ten was easier, they were mostly going 5-7, maybe 6-6 here and there. That was about how much they won per season under Kevin Wilson. To going 11-2 and 16-0. And having a winning record in those 2 years against teams inside the FPI top 25, the FPI top 15, the FPI top 10. Having an undefeated season last season. And one where, look, Indiana had faults. They weren't 2001 Miami or 2019 LSU in terms of NFL body of work. They, even last season, were not number 1 in NFL body of work. That would be Ohio State. But they were the most efficient team, they were the most disciplined team, and they had the best collection of starters in terms of how they fit. The puzzle was the most seamless puzzle out of all other college football puzzles, such that it was really hard to, dig in your fingernail or your finger or a knife and try to pry one of the pieces out and take the puzzle together. The puzzle was seamless, the pieces were glued together. That is a huge credit to Indiana's staff and their assistant coaches and Curt Cignetti. And the process they use to bring in these players, the process they use to develop them, and the type of player they go after. That combination, the ability to have a puzzle that is large and complex and intimidating, and to have all of those pieces fit together in the time frame necessary to go 16-0, to have all of them glued so solidly that even though those puzzle pieces aren't the most durable, they aren't the fastest, they aren't the biggest, they aren't the largest, they don't have the highest ceiling, and they go up against several teams that on paper do have those things in better quantity, and then to beat them, and in some cases beat them so soundly that you could only conclude that a very reliable metric to predict college football success, team talent, the only way you could come away with a correct takeaway from Indiana crushing Oregon is, the team talent index is either very incorrect or Indiana has something very unique here that triumphs something that is very ironclad. Can any program really have all of those things go correctly? And all of those things go correctly in a way that does not defy the law of close games, at least to a ridiculous degree. Or that maybe the team does get very fortunate with injuries. They had a healthy offensive line in the college football playoff, no injury to the QBs, but they still did suffer injuries. And when they did, they were still able to win games. When Stephen Daly went down after the Big Ten title game, they had players step up in the college football playoff against Indiana, against Alabama, and against Oregon to get pressure on opposing quarterbacks. So much went right, and in a way that, look, how they did it was sustainable as long as they can get those players. Can Minnesota or Wisconsin or Illinois or I'm going to say it. Can even an Iowa or Nebraska, who've had a lot of recent success, or in the case of Nebraska, has won titles before, can they get something like this in this way? And I think the answer is no, at least for now. Nebraska's a bit of a different story because they've done it before. But so much of this ties back into the head of the operation, that being Curt Cignetti for Indiana. And I'm mostly positive on Indiana. In fact, some people think I'm way too positive on Indiana. But there's a reason for that. As a reminder, I think Indiana is a national title contender this season, but I do not have them winning it all for now. And I do not think that Indiana was one of the greatest teams of all time in power ratings. I think it's foolish to compare 2019 LSU and 2025 Indiana because they played in different eras, completely different eras. I think it's foolish to even compare them with 2021 Georgia. I think it's foolish to compare Curt Cignetti with Nick Saban, to compare, different eras like that. It's foolish. Like comparing the Nebraska teams in the 1990s with LSU or even 2001 Miami is foolish because they played totally different games. And the eras were rapidly changing then. But I do think that if Indiana played 19 LSU, I think LSU would smoke them. Or 2001 Miami would smoke them. I do genuinely believe that because while I think Indiana would have the better staff, I think the roster matchup would be too poor and it would snowball pretty quickly. And that's the reason I'm actually so high on Indiana and why I love them so much. We're in an era where those type of teams can't be built anymore. The closest team to those type of teams last year was Ohio State, and that Ohio State team was Ryan Day's second, third, or worst team that he's ever fielded at Ohio State. And yet that was one of, like, the closest teams in terms of NFL talent to being an electric team because talent is more spread out than ever before, and the top teams in college football are getting weaker because of that, at least the top talented ones. With Curt Cignetti, to, from my perspective, go 16-0 and achieve more in a quicker turnaround than other coaches with teams that had far more talent, and to have a better record and to be better coached than teams who I think had way better players in some instances, but lost some games, means he's special, in a way. I don't know how special, but it's rare to get special coaches. It's rare to get Hall of Fame coaches. It's rare to get coaches who win at a high clip everywhere they've been. That's exceptionally rare, especially at his level, with, you know, making the playoff multiple years at IUP, or Elon, or James Madison, now making it multiple years at Indiana. And every time he got there, with I think maybe the exception of James Madison, he had to build that thing from the ground up. And he took James Madison through their transition into the FBS from the FCS, which was an entirely different football game. He's won everywhere he's been, and now he has a national championship. And he is 6-2 versus the top 10 ranked in the AP poll. I don't know what to tell you. Can any program get that? And does every program have one of the largest alumni bases in college football on top of that? Which, with Indiana, I'm not saying they were one of the wealthiest teams last year. I've heard that from, like, Matt Finks, a former Ohio State player, I believe, on Twitter, basically saying that, well, you know, if I had Mark Cuban, we could win it all. It's like, dude, Ohio State probably spends double of what Indiana does. Like, shut up. You don't know anything. That was one of the stupidest things I've ever heard from someone who probably knows more football than I do, and yet said something incredibly dumb about football. Like, stop it. That's not why they won. What I'm saying, though, is a great way to make up for some, like, lack of things in coaching is the money cannon. That is a great way to make up for coaching deficiencies. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect Venn diagram, or that's probably the incorrect analogy. It's not a perfect drywall patch, but it can patch up most of the hole. Except for when you get to the big games. And then as we've seen with Penn State, as we've seen with Texas so far under Sark, as we've seen time and time again, coaching is what matters at the end of the day. So many of these smaller programs, many of them, they do not have Curt Cignetti as their head coach. Even if they fired their current head coach, they wouldn't get a coach the caliber of Curt Cignetti or even close. And many of them also don't have the same NIL or spending potential that Indiana does. Again, Indiana right now is not one of the top spenders in terms of, like, top 5. Ohio State and Oregon and USC spend more than them in the Big Ten. Pretty sure Michigan does too. But they have the potential to be one of the top spenders and rival even some of those teams, and they're certainly top 25 in spending, I would say. A lot of these programs that we could talk about, Minnesota, Illinois, and maybe a Syracuse, a Boston College, Wake Forest, Duke, like these lower end teams, even an SEC team like, say, Mississippi State, or to circle back to the Big Ten of Rutgers or Maryland, they don't have that spending capability yet. And that's just basically saying they only do the bare minimum there, or they just hit what's necessary enough to field a competent team, not go the extra mile to get someone they really, really want. Indiana's staff pool is second in America. It's only behind Ohio State's. Like, those are the top two staff pools. Their staffs make the most in terms of combined salary. Who has that? The number one staff, or according to some, the number two staff at very worst, some the number three coach at worst, the number one coach at best. Who has a coach? What coaches are out there who could win it all in year two at a school that was a dump before they got there? You're looking at the potential candidates being Eric Morris, Oklahoma State, Bob Chesney, UCLA. That's kind of it. And maybe there are a few others. Maybe Florida State, with the alignment that they have, you could see something like that. Mike Norvell gets fired, and in year two, they hired someone who can bring them to the precipice. But Florida State also has an inherent talent edge over Indiana. Pat Fitzgerald at Michigan State could be a candidate. Kyle Whittingham at Michigan. Michigan's way too talented and spends way too much. It would not be as impressive for Whittingham to win it all in year two as Cignetti to do it in year two. You get the point. Indiana last season was number one or number two in any metric you looked at. Offense, defense, or at least they had an argument to be in those. Efficiency overall, power rating, special teams. They were top 10, and they had the number one strength of record. They were the only undefeated team at the end of the year. Who's doing that in year two? And the reason I make this video is not just for Indiana, because I praise Indiana enough as is, but it's to put into perspective that if you are a smaller program, you should be learning lessons from Indiana, but to expect yourselves to mimic them is a fool's errand. It just is. Think about Ohio State and Ryan Day. There is no coach who in year two of their tenure waltzed in and beat Ryan Day. The closest was Dan Lanning in year three. That was the closest. And it took Jim Harbaugh a while to beat Ohio State in that program. It was year three of Day, but Day would have beaten him in year two in 2020, even though that game was sadly never played. Cignetti did that with half the talent of those two coaches in year two against an undefeated Ohio State team. And very few coaches have an undefeated record against Dan Lanning. You have Kalen DeBoer and you have Curt Cignetti. That's it. Those are the two coaches that have an undefeated record. Undefeated record against Dan Lanning. Very few coaches go into Kinnick for the first time with a blue chip ratio disadvantage to Iowa and beat that team. They did. So why should we try to galvanize small teams to expect this? If they can get there, that's fantastic. It would be electric if Minnesota all of a sudden won the national title. That would be insane. Or for Illinois to do it, or Northwestern, or where Wisconsin's currently at, if they could rebound. If this is going to happen again at a different school, it probably will be a Big Ten team or maybe even a Big 12 team. Those are the schools that usually have, due to location, the lesser talent compared to the SEC, and they have the necessary size of endowments or the necessary good coaching and parts to maybe pull something off like that. But I just think it's very improbable. When you go in 2 years from having a pedestrian defense and offense to having an argument to have both the best defense and best offense in a single season and the best head coach and to go 16-0, and now you're even with a 10 to 15% BCR at best, you're one of the favorites to win the national title. You're top 6 in odds to win it all preseason. That's absurd. Who's doing that? If you think I'm wrong, tell me which coach is doing that. Which one? Because I just don't think that there are many. Don't think there are many. Not every small program, not any small program can do what Indiana did. I mean, I can tell you over and over again, I'd be beating a dead horse with the metrics or their achievements. Who's doing it? I mean, Indiana again is not the number one spender in college football, but they're above average at worst, and I would say good, great, with potential to be elite at the very best. They're improving Indiana's recruiting. They signed the number one portal class per on 3. They didn't lose a single starter to the portal. They produced 2 first-round NFL draft picks. They set a team record for NFL draft picks. They're 27-2 over 2 years with only 5 close wins, an average of 2.5 per year. It's not that unsustainable, guys. Teams win 2-3 close games all the time. Now, do they do that every year? That's hard, but it's not like they were winning 6 or they were winning 10 like Washington did in 2023 or TCU did before them. They're not winning close games at that clip in these very flukish, oh my gosh, big play ways. No, they're winning because of coaching. They're winning because of play calling, or because a player or two they have like makes a key play. And often it's close games against only the good teams, not Washington in 23 or TCU in 22 or Michigan State in 21, where they won close games against awful, dreadful teams that were power rated very low and had no business playing them that competitively. Indiana's only played in 1 close games against top-end teams, and you kind of had to do that to win a national title. You have to win some close games at the top level to survive and advance and win it all, especially in a current climate like ours, where sometimes you got to win 3 postseason games or to get to the national title game, to win a national championship. So, look, I appreciate the optimism in college football. I do think that teams have more of an opportunity, smaller teams have a higher floor than ever before, because teams at the top have a lower ceiling and also a lower floor. Teams at the top lose in this era of college football. And by teams at the top, I mean the teams that have always been at the top or were before NIL. So, like Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, they don't gain a single damn thing from this new era. They don't. Because whether due to history or tradition or proximity to good high school football, they were already at their peak in terms of potential then. Now that you introduce spending and other schools can compensate for their ability, they can say, hey, I know that program has better history, but I'll pay you more money than they will. That's a huge equalizer here. But let's not act like this is the NFL either. Ohio State's still the number 1 program in college football. And as far as I'm concerned, they're still pretty much recession-proof. Georgia under Kirby Smart is incredible. And Alabama is still recruiting at a fairly good level so far under DeBoer and still winning games. The same things that we saw in college football in the 21st century remain. They're just toned down a bit. And that's what makes what Indiana did so incredible and unbelievable, and it's why I'm going to continue making videos about this. People are not talking about enough what they did and how they did was so incredible. It shouldn't have been possible. It was an impossible thing that they made possible by their sheer willpower. It's not like Oregon decided, okay, yeah, we're just going to let these guys roll over us. It's not like Ohio State decided to intentionally shank a close field goal that should have been an easy make. It's not like Alabama decided to let themselves get destroyed by 30-plus points. Indiana did those things. They controlled their own destiny. And to do that with the talent they had, with the situation they were in only a few years earlier, with their history, is absurd. And I don't think it will be replicated. If Indiana replicates it, and they'd be the one team I would say they do, they're going to do it with more talent, as they're only going to get more talented from here on out. And it won't be the same because they will have shown, hey, we did this before, so it won't come as much of a surprise. Asking another program with an entirely different staff, an entirely different roster, history, location, to do that again and say that they can, maybe there's a sliver of a chance. But I also think that there needs to be realism with some of these programs. And I believe the better approach for many of these programs, since they're not going to have as good of a coach as Signetti or as good of a staff, not nearly, is to cycle up in certain years and then not like literally tank, because you can't tank in college sports, but you sacrifice 1 year to be a bad year where you only go bowling at best or maybe even have a losing record. But then you do that to make sure you can more heavily invest in a specific year. Or you trade in being good for 4 years to simply being above average or mediocre in 3, but potentially be elite in 1 year. I think with NIL budgets and NIL inflation and chaos, that's probably a more realistic approach. Hopefully that wasn't too long-winded, but this one won't be. Talking about Julian Sayin's path to be the #1 quarterback in college football. As a redshirt freshman, Julian Sayin set the regular season record for completion percentage. Now he enters in his second season as a starter with a more veteran offensive line, a superior play caller, with Jeremiah Smith together with him for 3 seasons, so even better chemistry with the best wide receiver in America, and he has Bo Jackson back, who was one of the best, if not maybe the best freshman in the Big Ten last season, could be the best running back in all of college football. So I want to talk about how Sayin can evolve from being a great quarterback last year, which he was. He was, I think 3rd in QBR to end the season, top 10 or top 5 QB for sure at the end. This season, I want to discuss how he can not just be top 5, not just that he could improve as he should and probably will. How can he be #1? What needs to happen for Sayin to be the best quarterback in America? Well, he's already pretty close to that. When you complete 77% of your passes, you're close. And there's context behind that. There is the context that, on one hand, he had the 2 best wide receivers in the sport. And he also had a pretty easy schedule in general. That goes against him. What goes for him, though, is he faced a wonderful Texas defense in week 1 and completed 65% of his passes in his first start. That's pretty good for your first ever game as a starter. And in all of his following games, up until his game against Rutgers, where both Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith were out, so he was operating with really kind of just an above average to average receiver core at best, because Ohio State wasn't super deep at receiver last year. For that is 5 games in a row, in all those games, he completed 70% or more of his passes. With just absurd ball placement, always delivering into the chest of receivers or right where he knew they could get it, making correct decisions, rarely throwing interceptions. He always had, from there on out, a QBR that was in the 70s or above. And in Big Ten conference play, in every game in Big Ten play, he had a QBR in the 80s or higher. And that adjusts for opponent played, that adjusts for strength of schedule. He's a damn good quarterback. And that game against Michigan where he responded after the interception, the game against Indiana where he took some sacks, maybe, didn't get the ball out quickly enough. It was his first game in his career against a defense that finished top 10 in ESPN's efficiency. Facing the best defense and the best team all season long, it was a high-pressure moment with Ohio State being in their first Big Ten title game since 2020, and his offensive line didn't do him any favors. I don't think the play calling did either. The tight ends didn't either. Look, that game was not all on him. He still completed over 70% of his throws, had a passing touchdown, really good throw to Carnell Tate, and he only threw 1 pick, which was a wonderful play by Lewis Moore, a great college safety. Against Miami, he still completed 62.9% of his passes. One of his interceptions was basically in garbage time after Miami locked up the win. The other was a pick 6 that honestly I think was more on play calling and more on Jeremiah Smith for not blocking properly than it was on him. That was a play designed to only go to that receiver, and Miami and Xavier Scott or Miles, I'm forgetting the name of that player. I think not Miles Scott, Keontae Scott. There's a lot of defensive backs. Miles Scott, Xavier Scott at Illinois, Keontae Scott, former Auburn DB, went to Miami. Sorry for the confusion there. He was really good last year, even in losses. He had some issues, but I think they're very correctable. So not taking long sacks, that will go a long way. Because those long sacks that he took against Miami, and to a lesser degree against Indiana, completely busted drives and shut them down and stopped them. Using his legs more, whether on, options, or whether being more willing to scramble and make contact, which he's talked about in the preseason, that's good news. Just another year of experience being coached by Billy Fessler, being mentored in Ryan Day's system, another year in the strength and conditioning program led by Mickey Marotti. All of these things go to his benefit. All of these things do. And most importantly, having better play calling. Brian Hartline was huge to the Ohio State program. There's no doubt about that. Brian Hartline is maybe the best position coach in the history of college football. Just is what it is when you recruit and develop at that level. However, I also think that it's wise at the same time to acknowledge that Hartline was really a first-time play caller. He's now going to be a first-time head coach at USF. And Arthur Smith has been a play caller at the NFL level for years now, and was also a head coach in the NFL. So you just get more of an experienced, more of an adult veteran play caller in the room, and that can help a quarterback like Sayin. His supporting cast can also help. I mean, you look at Bo Jackson, you look at Legend Bay at running back, Jeremiah Smith, Brandon Innes, Devin McCoon, Chris Henry Jr. and Brock Boyd, who I think will start over McCoon and Innes, but I don't know that for sure. They're freshmen. And the tight end position, I'm not exactly optimistic on that, but I think in Arthur Smith's system, as long as they're okay, Ohio State's so ridiculously good and in some cases even overpowered at the other positions, where is it really going to matter? Especially if the offensive line takes the steps forward that you and I think it will. So he has the path to get there. It's a path that is challenging. It's a path that's going to require him to clean up some things on his own. But his supporting cast is damn good. His coaching's really good. And he was a year one player. I do agree with some that Sayin at the end of last year was quite a bit, how do I put it, overhated. I thought he was overrated by some towards the end of last season. But then after the Indiana game and after the Miami game, and with some time in the preseason to think about it, I mean, I'm seeing him outside of the top 10 in some QB lists, and that's stupid. That's a bad take. He is a lock to be a top 10 quarterback, and I think that this is what happens when someone buys into something too quickly, and then they see what it actually is, and they overreact. There were people last year that were comparing Julian Sayin to being better than CJ Stroud, which it's like, okay, I do not know what you're watching if you think that way. That was my thought early on. And then when it was revealed that he was not CJ Stroud, and actually quite a bit worse in those two big games, everyone, or not everyone, but a lot of people just panic sold him. And that's not what you do. Especially at a program like Ohio State, with the reputation they have at quarterback, where every quarterback Ryan Day ever started at Ohio State has went on to be drafted. With Ohio State, you are looking at a team last year that overachieved relative to preseason expectations. You're looking at a team this year that returns a lot on the offensive side of the ball, which was the key weakness of this team last year in general. Not just one position, though there was a position or two that were the crux of the issue, but they just didn't mesh together, period. I mean, I remember the Miami and Indiana game where the wide receivers outside of Jeremiah Smith just didn't look all that good. They didn't look all that tough. They didn't look like they were kind of a bit disheveled and shocked that the opponent could punch with them pound for pound, except for Smith, who was still killing everyone in his way. And now that you have, again, a more veteran play caller who should better be able to understand what needs to be done with the players and resources he has, and the entire offensive side of the ball pretty much is a year older, they're still as talented as ever, they return their best player. I think that's the path for Sayin to be the nation's best QB. Honestly, is just continue to be who he has been. And whether or not that's enough, we'll see. But I think that can be enough. He's accurate. His arm strength is good. It's not Joe Milton level. It's not elite, but it's good. His arm isn't weak. It's just not the strongest thing in the universe. His accuracy, though, is the strongest thing in the universe. And he has good decision making. And he's shown moments where, he can maneuver around in the pocket and have good pocket awareness and extend plays down the field. In high school, he was effective enough at running the football, too, to keep defenses honest. So we know he has talent. It was year one in a new system with a bit of a disheveled offense. And by new system, I mean, look, like Chip Kelly and Brian Hartline are different caliber coaches. Arthur Smith is, even if Arthur Smith doesn't pan out, he will be closer to a Chip Kelly level play caller just due to the type of ball he wants to play and also the experience than what Brian Hartline wanted to do as Ohio State's play caller and offensive coordinator. So everything's set up for Sayin to succeed. I definitely think right now he's battling Dante Moore for being the best quarterback in the Big Ten. He's battling other quarterbacks across the sport for being the best in America. We're just going to have to see how it pans out this year, but I would actually say buy a bit of Julian Sayin stock if you haven't already. I think that a little bit of people, even some Ohio State fans themselves, are a bit too low on him. A lot of the issues that you saw with him last year can be explained by youth, can be explained by the staff not utilizing him properly or utilizing the team properly, and the fact that when you have the offensive line missing assignments like they did, or the right side is jags at best or bad players at worst, and the unit's disheveled and a bit overvalued due to the playoff success the team had the previous year, well, if your quarterback doesn't have the best cast surrounding him, and he's young, and he goes from not being pressured all season to his protectors up front getting beaten getting their crap beaten out of them, you can't really blame him for taking a bit to adjust to that. And Ohio State was in those games as is. So I'm buying a bit of Julian Sayin this year. He could easily be college football's best quarterback this fall. Just want to clarify, too, I said college football's best quarterback. I do not think Sayin is going to be a round one, pick one type guy, but that's different. In different drafts, Mendoza would not have been a round one, pick one quarterback. All I'm saying in saying that is he's not going to be viewed by the NFL the way Arch Manning will, due to measurables, or the way that Joe Burrow was viewed, from what I can tell. But he can be the number one college QB. Being number one college QB is way different from being NFL draft QB number one. Way, way different. So what does Lincoln Riley need to do? What does he need to change to succeed at USC? I'm not a coach, never have claimed to be, but I can read trends, I can read data, I can pick up on things. And here are some things for USC fans to pay attention to this fall that will determine whether or not Riley succeeds long-term at USC. First and foremost, Riley needs to do a better job on the road. USC needs to perform better on the road. It's the Big Ten. You are going to travel. You are going to play teams in the cold. You are going to have jet lag. You must accept this fact. You must not complain about it. You must deal with it. Okay, so how do you deal with it? First of all, you out-recruit the Big Ten. Check. USC's doing that. You then develop at a high level so that you can even beat schools with less talent that develop well. A little bit to be determined on that, but I think there were encouraging signs last season. And you manage games properly. Against Illinois, you burn more clock before giving them back the football. You do that. You don't call finessey trick plays against Illinois or against Notre Dame when you know you have some weaknesses in some areas. And yeah, the reward of those plays is high, but the floor, especially on the road in these close games, can be disastrous. And we saw it in those cases. John Ray Reed with an eligible receiver downfield and Lemon fumbling that ball, those trying to be a little bit too cute only really bit USC in the rear last year. Outside of that one trick play to New Kinds against Oregon, where it did pay off for a score, but they may have scored without that trick play anyway, being cute has not really helped USC in the Big Ten so far. It's not. So I look at Riley, and on that part, it's a no right now. USC has not learned that yet, which I will die on the hill of saying if they manage the game better against Illinois, they win. I also think if they managed the game better and were more fundamentally sound, they would have beaten Notre Dame. They had good matchups against Notre Dame. Their issues with the offensive line due to injury and then bad special teams play and that trick play they ran is ultimately what killed them in that game. Notre Dame was the better team. USC could have played them more competitively, and they didn't do it. And a lot of that was self-inflicted. Over the past 2 seasons, Riley is 16-10, and he is 11-7 in Big Ten play. There have been encouraging signs, last season, for example, and how they played Penn State competitively in 2024. But when I look at USC right now and Lincoln Riley right now, and where are things that are lacking? Game management, an understanding of what the meta in college football is right now, and discipline are areas that have a bit of soreness to them. Penalties, turnovers, botched trick plays, botched special teams plays, missing the field goal, I believe, against Oregon. I believe they missed the field goal in that game, the one right before half by Sayin. Letting Notre Dame return that kickoff for a touchdown after taking the lead in South Bend. I mean, Notre Dame and Oregon made stupid mistakes in those games too. Oregon had ungodly amounts of penalty yardage, struggled to run the ball, had both their tackles pulled from the game due to injury. Notre Dame with C.J. Carr threw an interception at the goal line, which kept USC in the game. And USC still lost both those games by double digits because they couldn't take advantage of the opponent's mistakes. That's another thing, too. Failing to take advantage of opponent's mistakes. Against Illinois, they had 2 very lucky fumbles when Illinois was going to score touchdowns, if not for those turnovers. One of those was not a fumble. Forward progress was stopped before Fagan fumbled that, and that was before the half, and USC got very lucky on that. The other was forced, and I will give USC credit there. And yet to not win that game with that situation, that's a bit wild. And that falls back on the head coach. We can talk about USC in 2024, for example, where it felt like for the entire first half, they were respecting Michigan's ability to throw the football. And if they just didn't do that for the whole game, they probably win. Or how they let Michigan march down the field by running for a 2-minute drill. Or losing to Mike Loxley, which is a crime against humanity. Lincoln Riley, to succeed, needs to double down on the developmental aspect of his program, which I think he has trended in the right direction there, but more needs to be seen. USC needs to recruit and spend like a serious program. That's checked. They are doing that. I do believe Riley has offense down, and that's still key. We need to see if he has defense down, but I think they're trending in the right direction there. The Lynn hiring pointed to that, and the Patterson hire, I think, points to it too. Really, all that's missing and what we have not seen yet is a change in game management style that benefits winning over playing the type of game that Riley wants to play, which is offense. It's scoring a lot of points, and it's the snowball effect, which is very, very satisfying. It's very satisfying where you can just keep scoring points and you begin putting your opponent in a mental and physical blender and they can't keep up. But that's not the modern meta of college football. And now, with defenses learning and adapting, when you play that game, there's more of a risk now than ever before, where instead you're the team that gets snowballed because you're trying to play a quick game. You're trying to score a ton of points. You have to score a ton of points to win. Well, if the opponent can also score a ton of points on your defense, but their defense is good enough to stop your offense, well, you get what usually has happened to Lincoln Riley in big games in his career, where they get handily beaten. The playoff appearances in 18 and 19, losing to Utah in 2022 in the Pac-12 title game, losing to Oregon in 2023, and UCLA that same season, losing in 2024 the way they did at different times, losing in 2025 to Oregon, to Notre Dame, for example. So they are heading in the right direction, but Riley does need to change some things if he wants to succeed at USC. It all comes down to coaching in college football. The coaches and the assistants, because these players are young men and they're college age and their brains are very close to being formed. Some of them are totally formed, but especially these high schoolers just, coming out, they have so much life experience ahead of them. They haven't been treated all the time as adults yet. There's still so much about forming, their worldview, forming their habits and helping them and developing them as young men that will forever be different from what the NFL does, even if college football adopts an NFL model. And with USC, that's what you need to double down on. You need to parlay your recruiting success with development into winning at a high level and managing games correctly and being an example to your players of how to take care of yourself by putting yourself in the best position to win. And that's what Riley needs to do. I know that might be cliche or it might sound like it's easy. It's not. I'm not going to say like what specific defense or offense they should run because I'm so horrifically unqualified to do that. But there are some simple trends I can pick up on. Like Lincoln Riley at USC has never covered a spread in the Eastern time zone at USC. He's never done that. He hasn't covered, I believe, in fact, outside of the state of California, depending on what book you use for sports betting or what book you look at. They've performed terribly on the road. They've done poorly in big games, even in big games where they led at some point. And a lot of it does come back to game management, style of play, in some instances as well, a lack of developing the talent they have, while other schools with less or similar talent do a better job of developing or better understand the modern meta strategy to win in college football, which right now currently is defense and running the ball, but specifically making sure you have a high floor for running the ball, not having a high ceiling in exchange for trading in, a low floor. So, lot to do for USC to be a top program, but I believe they're heading in the right direction, and in the future I will be making a video discussing 10 reasons why I believe USC will succeed with Lincoln Riley and eventually compete for national titles. Okay, Better or Worse is a new series that we are starting, and it is talking about whether or not different teams across college football will be better or worse than they were in 2026. And I will discuss both team quality, so that would be power ratings for most people with human input, and also record, wins and losses. It's difficult with Nebraska. It's difficult, but I ultimately think I have my answer. Will Nebraska improve or regress from 2026? In this video series of Better or Worse, we'll be looking at the Nebraska Cornhuskers today. Nebraska last season was a 7-6 football team with a 4-5 record in Big Ten play. They improved by one win in the regular season from the year before. in Big Ten play and an overall record. And that's what we're going to care about here. Nebraska did technically get better from a record standpoint in 2025 compared to 2024 because for a variety of reasons, due to uneven matchups, due to the fact that there's always a lot of opt-outs in bowl games now, I'm not really going to count those. However, I will say for Nebraska that they technically... However, I will say that Nebraska technically regressed in terms of power ratings in 2025 from 2024. Look at this graphic here that shows Nebraska's 5-year program trend. They've been trending up in win-loss record. Their FPI score, and specifically their FPI efficiency score, though, regressed a little bit or even a sizable amount from 2024 to 2025. Their recruiting also took a bit of a hit, not necessarily in terms of quality, but they recruited quite a small class. And whenever you do that, it is a gamble because you're banking on making up for that with future classes. It seems like Nebraska's going to do that for their 2027 recruiting class with the nation's best quarterback in Trey Taylor, one of the nation's best safeties in Torrey Pittman, and many others on that team. We're talking about 2026, though, not 2027, which is when that class can have an impact. Nebraska lost their 2 best players last year, Emmett Johnson and Dylan Raiola. Raiola transferred to Oregon. Emmett Johnson, well, he left for the NFL and got drafted by the Kansas City Chiefs. Hopefully he does a pretty good job there. Nebraska returns a good portion of its defense. They return a good portion of their receiver room, and they return some key parts of the offensive line, such as their center, Justin Evans, and their left tackle, Elijah Pritchett. Gunnar Gatula, Sam Sledge, these are other players that have played at multiple different points that also return to the team, though they're projected to be backups. Paul Mabenja, Brendan Black, and Tree Babalade, maybe Babalade, sorry if I mispronounced his name, those are transfers that came in as either redshirt juniors or seniors who will be starting on the Cornhusker offensive line. So they have an old offensive line. That's a good sign. And Pritchett and Evans were good at the end of last year. They have Quasi Gilmer and Isaiah Hunter and Ja'Cory Barney at wide receiver. That's pretty damn good. And Luke Lindenmeyer returns at tight end. Really, the question for their offense and whether or not it will improve is quarterback and running back. And that is going to determine a lot. They were not good on offense last year, post Raiola going down in particular. They were never good on defense the whole season. They were 126th in EPA per rush surrendered, which is basically saying they gave up a bunch of explosive runs, but also couldn't get teams off the field when they decided to run the football consistently or several times in a row. Their run defense was multiple in a very trash and cancerous way, giving up big runs, giving up long drives where they didn't surrender a big run, but gave up consistently 4, 5, or 6 yards. It was bad. The offense was okay at running the ball, and they were pretty damn good, I would say, at passing the football pre-Raiola getting hurt, as long as the offensive line could hold up. Did a very poor job at that against Michigan, Michigan State, and Minnesota. After that Minnesota game, I don't know what was said in the locker room, but it felt against Northwestern and USC, who had pretty good pass rushes, and I would argue actually had better pass rushes than Minnesota and Michigan State. It felt like Nebraska just blocked them better. I wonder if there's probably something said in the locker room after that game that galvanized the team and the offensive line specifically. The offense showed moments of promise at receiver, at quarterback, running back. Left tackle Elijah Pritchett improved as the season went on. It was the much better unit than the defense, in my personal opinion. Defensively, there's nowhere to go but up. The question is, how high is the ceiling? Like, how far up will they go? They return Vincent Shavers, Andrew Marshall, Williams Winery, Cameron Lenhart, and Riley Van Poppel. They don't bring back a lot of starters from this unit, but and Donovan Jones at nickel. Shouldn't have forgotten him. Donovan Jones was pretty good last year for being a redshirt freshman. He had 5 passes defended and an interception. And he's a Nebraska kid, so that's a pretty cool story, actually, given their history. Not returning a lot on that defense is a pretty good thing, especially when incoming transfers Owen Chambliss and Dwayne McDougall III had a lot of success at San Diego State with now Husker defensive coordinator Rob Orich. And the 4-2-5 defense much better fits the metagame now than the 3-3-5. The 3-3-5 worked in the old Big 12 when offense was supreme. Like, that was a really good innovation. And there are moments where that type of defense could be appropriate in a specific play call if you can go multiple on defense like some of the deeper teams can. But now the 4-man defensive front is more important than ever before. Way more important. Defensive backs are taller and bigger. Linebackers are a little bit lighter. They're not necessarily shorter, but they're lighter because they're, more to be used in pass rush and pass defense than only stopping the run. And in order to stop the run, as offenses are shifting to being heavier in general and running the ball more, you have to have dominant defensive line play. And Nebraska's 3-3-5, even when Tony White had success with it, was never particularly elite at stopping the run. There were moments where they were great, there were moments where they were fantastic, but it was inconsistent. They need a scheme, a defense that can be consistent at stopping better offenses, and I think Rob Orich's defense is better suited for that. Nebraska is a lock, in my opinion, to be better at D-line and linebacker. The question is whether or not they will be better at safety. They did lose Sear Wright. They lost some other much more experienced players, but they do return Andrew Marshall, Donovan Jones, and Dwayne McDougall III does transfer in. Another question is in regards to the special teams. They do return Archie Wilson and Kyle Kunanen and Ja'Cory Barney Jr., so all their key special teams players come back, but a coach can mean a whole lot to that unit. Special teams is a lot about coaching and mentality. And I'm curious to see if Nebraska is able to maintain that energy and fight that Mike Eckler brought over, or if they're going to regress a little bit there. Because before Mike Eckler came over, Nebraska's special teams under Rule and just in general was quite horrid to look at. From a power ratings angle, I think we've nailed down that Nebraska is certainly going to be better or the same team. They're top 5 in returning production, 3rd to be specific. They did a really good job only losing, I think, one key starter to the portal, that being Raiola, which was huge, but they didn't lose many others, and they brought in some key players in the portal as well. They've recruited well enough, and at some positions, I'd say, like receiver and DB, they've developed well enough. Running back, too. More of the skill position parts, the areas that require more speed. I think they've done a good job developing there. I'd like to see better development in O-line and D-line, but that could have been on the position coaches and not necessarily the whole strength and conditioning or developmental program. I love the addition of Jeep Wade. I love the hires they made on defense, too. I think this is Rule's strongest staff and strongest roster. So for that, I'm going to lock in. You see on the power meter that my graphic designer came up with and that I use. Thank you. Shout out to Jake for making that possible. On the power meter, Nebraska will be much closer to good than average this upcoming season. And I expect their success rate, points per play margin, and EPA per play margin to be in the positives, while most of them were in the negatives last season. However, that does not necessarily mean their record is going to improve. Why is that? Well, the schedule is tougher, and while I think Nebraska's staff has improved, it's not one of the top staffs, in my opinion, in the Big Ten quite yet. We need a larger sample size for that. I like Rob Orich and Dana Holgorsen, and I believe that both are certainly top 30 coordinators in college football. Holgorsen's a great offensive mind. Orich is... I like coaches that have consistent success at lower levels as coordinators and then rise through the ranks. I mean, Corey Heatherman reminds me of this. Bryant Haynes reminds me of this. I mean, at some point, Matt Patricia was just a defensive assistant. Phil Parker at Iowa was just a secondary coach. He had a ton of success there, and he becomes the DC and is one of the greats there. Jesse Minter, Mike McDonald at some point were just position coaches. They learned from the best in the NFL, then rose up. I like the addition. Matt Rule and some of the assistants, but more so Matt Rule, though. I have some questions about him in regards to game management. Program builder, perfect. Elite culture guy. Knows how to get the attention of his players. Is good at motivating them. And has had moments of impressive strategic performance. Like the Ohio State game in 2024, the USC game last year, the fact that I think they did play Michigan more competitively than they should have last season. However, we can't ignore that every year they do lose a game they should not. Last year, that being Minnesota. And they could have lost to one of Michigan. They could have lost to Michigan State or Northwestern. They didn't, but they shouldn't have been in a position to lose to those teams either. The year before, losing to UCLA and blowing that lead to Illinois. And the year before that, losing to Michigan State, losing to Maryland, losing all those close games. And when you have that situation where you have a good staff, but it's not fantastic, and then you have this schedule of Ohio, Bowling Green, North Dakota, at Michigan State, Maryland, Indiana, at Oregon, bye, Washington, at Illinois, at Rutgers, Ohio State, at Iowa, and your win total 6.5. This schedule is so much tougher than last year's that the fact their win totals in between 6 and 7 means that they're viewed as a better team than last year by the books and by the people that spend hours and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars researching this and getting it correctly. The sports books. It's a huge industry that knows what it's talking about. It's why I follow it, even though I don't personally bet nor advise that you should. But 6.5 also means more likely than not, Nebraska is going to be the same or worse record-wise. So it's an interesting thing to pay attention to. The schedule's much tougher. The team is better. In order for Nebraska to have a better record this season, especially since they won a lot of close games last year. In fact, the law of close games would suggest that they're going to win less close games this season. Odds are the team quality improves and Nebraska's record regresses. That's what the odds say for this team. For me, I'm looking at Nebraska right now, and it depends on two things for me. Anthony Calandria and the defensive front, because I'm confident in pretty much everything else to function at a passable or great level, or somewhere in between. Calandria could be a bust, and he could also be an upgrade for what they want to do over Raiola. I don't think he's a better QB than Raiola, but he could be more helpful to what they need than Raiola could be. Very inconsistent at Virginia, cleaned up his game at UNLV with 19 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He still fumbled quite a bit. I think he needs to clean up even more things at Nebraska, but if he does that and the offensive line improves and the run game doesn't take a big step back, he could command a dangerous offense that can keep Nebraska competing in a lot of these games and even cause some snowball blowouts in other matchups. Williams Nwaneri is another player I'm paying attention to. Only had 2.5 sacks last year, but 28 pressures, where he led the team in that category. 6'7", appropriate weight, appropriate strength. He has all the measurables in the world to be an NFL player. Just need to see a breakthrough year from him. If they can get a breakthrough year out of him, the defense is going to explode, given the superior scheme, alignment, better play calling, and I think better players at linebacker, but also in parts of the defensive backfield. They need him to explode, though, because if they can turn him into a game wrecker, then games against Indiana at home or Ohio State at home look like they could even be possible wins in a supreme upset. And games against Washington, Illinois, Rutgers, and Iowa look much easier. My final verdict is that Nebraska's record will stay the same. I have them at 7 wins right now. Regular season, same as last season, but the team quality will noticeably improve. Had that really, really annoying itch. That was super annoying. Okay. I know the stream's been going long. I do need to take a little bit of a water break, though, just about 5 minutes. So I will do that. Then we'll be back and talk about some news for the day and then get right on out of here. Boom. We're back. So what's going on at Michigan State here? Chaos, I think, is the best word to describe the state of Michigan State. And it's really bad. Really, really, really bad. What Michigan State, wow, they're going to be on their third athletic director of the 2020s. And didn't it actually it'll be fourth because I think Bill Beekman, oh, of course LinkedIn isn't going to let me log in and see his tenure. When Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, my gosh. Yeah. MSU is going to be on their fourth athletic director. Yep. Fourth athletic director. Um, wow. Just doing some... I'm making sure I'm confirming my facts here. 2, 3. Whoa. Gosh. That's wild. Oh, shoot. I also forgot. Of course I did. I forgot to record the live show. That's unfortunate. Forgot to record that. Okay. Since I forgot to record the live show, which is my bad, and all that means is these videos won't be up until tomorrow, unfortunately. And since I want the Michigan State thing to be something that I can release pretty quickly, we'll talk about that tomorrow, and we'll talk about what the Texas Tech news means tomorrow, because I'm not even going to be able to get these segments out. Same with the bold prediction one. We'll move that stuff to tomorrow, which will be a pretty big show. The show has been long enough as is. Thank you guys for coming on. Sorry about that last minute change. I wasn't planning on that, but apparently I forgot to record the segment on OBS, which is my bad. So these videos will be up sometime tomorrow. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you all very soon.